The scratch of the plastic spoon against the concrete floor of cell 402 was the only way Chief Warrant Officer Elena Vance kept track of the humidity levels inside the Black Mountain holding facility. Most of the guards thought she was trying to sharpen the utensil into a shiv, a futile effort that they laughed about over their lukewarm coffee in the monitoring booth. But Elena wasn't interested in a piece of jagged plastic. She was listening to the resonance. Every morning at exactly 0600, when the facility's industrial dehumidifiers kicked on, the concrete expanded by a fraction of a millimeter. By dragging the spoon across the floor at a constant pressure, she could hear the pitch change. On Tuesday, it was a flat D natural. By Friday, the summer heat baking the Idaho mountainside above them had pushed the pitch toward a sharp D sharp. The mountain was breathing, and Elena was the only one counting its breaths. Elena Vance was 34 years old, and for the last 182 days, she had been a ghost. Back in Steubenville, Ohio, where the rusted skeletons of steel mills still watched the Ohio River like forgotten sentinels, her father would have told her that she was just doing what Vance's had always done, surviving the weight of the world. Her father had been a master welder, a man who could hear a hairline fracture in a pressure vessel from 50 feet away just by the way the steam hissed. He taught her that everything in the world had a frequency: the mills, the river, the human heart. If you knew the frequency, you knew the weakness. Elena had taken that Ohio intuition and polished it into a weapon for the United States Army. Before Black Mountain, Elena was the person the Pentagon sent in when a structure was too dangerous to enter and too important to destroy. She was a structural acoustics specialist, a niche sub-branch of signal intelligence that most generals didn't even know existed until they needed it. She could look at a blueprint for 5 minutes and tell you exactly where to place a single ounce of C4 to bring down a skyscraper without breaking a single window on the street below. Or, more importantly, she could sit in a room and tell you what was happening 3 floors up just by the way the floorboards groaned under a human foot. Now, she was a prisoner in a facility that didn't officially exist. The Army had processed her as killed in action 6 months ago, after a botched extraction in a place no one was supposed to be. The men who held her weren't enemies in the traditional sense. They wore the same flag she had on her shoulder for 12 years, but they represented a shadow of the institution that had curdled into something unrecognizable. They kept her here because she knew too much about the structural failures of a certain private sector defense project, and because they thought a woman who spent her life listening to walls would eventually break under the weight of them. Staff Sergeant Miller, the primary night guard, liked to stand outside her heavy steel door and talk about his truck. He was a man from North Carolina who missed the sound of a V8 engine and the smell of pine needles. He treated Elena like a piece of furniture that occasionally needed to be dusted. He would lean against the doorframe, his shadow stretching long across her floor, and talk to specialist Ortiz about the performance of his Ford F-150. He didn't think she could hear him. He didn't think she was even there anymore. "She's gone tilt," Miller said one rainy Tuesday evening, his voice muffled but clear to Elena's trained ear. "Look at her, hasn't blinked in 10 minutes, just staring at that corner like there's a goddamn television there. 6 months in the dark does that, the brain just turns the lights off." Elena didn't move. She was staring at the corner, but she wasn't seeing the mold-stained concrete. She was seeing the way the vibration from the facility's main cooling fan traveled through the load-bearing pillar in the northwest corner. The fan was slightly out of balance. A bearing was failing, probably the lower assembly. Every 3 seconds, it sent a rhythmic shudder through the foundation. That shudder traveled through the floor, hit the wall, and reflected back. In that corner, the waves met. They created a standing wave, a tiny, invisible point of pressure that was slowly, microscopically, eroding the mortar of a seam that the builders had tried to hide behind a layer of industrial epoxy. She wasn't broken. She was calibrating. To be emotionally controlled was not the same as being cold, though men like Miller couldn't tell the difference. Elena felt the cold of the cell in her marrow. She felt the hunger that lived like a dull ache behind her ribs. She felt the sharp, jagged edge of the betrayal that had landed her here. But she kept those feelings in a small, pressurized chamber in the back of her mind. If she let them out, they would create noise. And if she was going to survive, she needed absolute silence. Life in Steubenville hadn't been easy, and it hadn't been quiet. The mills ran 24 hours a day. The house she grew up in shook every time a coal train rattled past. You learned to sleep through the chaos by finding the rhythm in it. You learned that people shouted when they were lying and whispered when they were dangerous. Her mother had left when she was 6, leaving her with a father who spoke mostly in the language of metallurgy and a dog named Blue who could hear a thunderstorm coming 3 counties away. She had joined the army because it was the only place that offered a life that felt as solid as steel. She excelled at Fort Leonard Wood, not because she was the strongest or the fastest, though she held her own, but because she saw the geometry of the battlefield. During urban warfare drills, she didn't look for the enemy. She looked for the way the buildings leaned. She knew which walls would provide cover and which ones would turn into shrapnel. By the time she made Chief Warrant Officer, she was the go-to expert for difficult extractions. The mission that ended her career had been in the high desert of the American Southwest, at a testing range that had been leased to a contractor called Ethelgard. They were building something, a deep earth storage facility that Elena's sensors told her was structurally unsound. She had filed the report. She had sent it up the chain, bypassed her immediate supervisor when he told her to bury it, and went straight to the Pentagon. 2 days later, her transport was diverted. 2 days after that, she was in a cage in Black Mountain. The facility was an old Cold War relic, a continuity of government bunker carved into the granite of the Idaho Panhandle. It was designed to survive a nuclear blast, which meant it was designed to be a tomb. There were 32 cells in her wing. She knew this not because she had seen them, but because she had mapped the plumbing. Every time a toilet flushed, the sound traveled through the pipes, and Elena timed the delay. She knew the occupancy of the wing better than the guards did. There were 14 other prisoners. 3 were in the medical wing, judging by the frequency of the oxygen concentrators she heard humming through the vents. The rest were scattered. "Ortiz, you ever think about what happens when the lease runs out on this place?" Miller asked. It was nearing midnight. The facility was in its low-power cycle. The lights were dimmed to a sickly amber. "I don't think about it, Sarge," Ortiz replied. He was younger, probably from a suburb outside of Phoenix. He sounded tired. He sounded like a man who was starting to realize that guarding a ghost was a haunting experience. "I just do the rotations. Another 2 months and I'm back at Fort Carson." "The colonel says we're sunsetting the project," Miller said. He lowered his voice, but not enough. To Elena, the drop in volume actually made the consonants sharper. "He says the paperwork is being finalized. Total erasure." Elena's heart rate didn't spike, but the pressure in her chest increased. Total erasure was a military euphemism that usually involved shredders, incinerators, and in the case of black sites, a very quiet burial of the human assets. She had known this day would come. Ethelgard couldn't keep 14 people in a hole forever. It was too expensive, too risky. Eventually, the liabilities had to be removed from the balance sheet. She stood up. It was the first time she had stood up at this hour in 3 months. In the monitoring booth, a green light on the sensor panel would be blinking, but the guards were used to the broken woman moving in her sleep. She walked to the north wall. Her bare feet felt the vibration of the failing fan bearing. It was stronger now. The mountain was dry, the granite brittle from the summer heat. She placed her palm against the concrete. Most people think of stone as solid, but to Elena it was a slow-moving liquid. It had pores. It had tension. It had a memory of the pressure that formed it. She closed her eyes and let the map in her head expand. To her left, 70 feet of solid rock, then the primary elevator shaft. That was a death trap. The guards had it wired with biometric locks and a manual override that only the colonel possessed. To her right, the administrative wing, heavily guarded. Behind her, the other cells, but in front of her was the ghost. In 1958, when the Army Corps of Engineers had first blasted this bunker, they had encountered a fault line. To stabilize it, they had poured a secondary reinforced concrete sleeve inside the granite. But the sleeve didn't perfectly align with the original excavation. There was a gap, a 4-inch void that ran from the base of the mountain to the ventilation arrays at the summit. It was a mistake, an architectural hiccup that had been covered up by 60 years of dust and bad paperwork. Elena had found it on her 3rd day. She had heard a cricket. The sound had been faint, a rhythmic chirping that shouldn't have been possible in a pressurized, filtered environment. She had tracked the sound for weeks, listening to the way it echoed. The cricket wasn't in the vents. It was asterisk behind asterisk the wall. It had come in through a drainage seep at the surface and tumbled down the void. If a cricket could get in, air could get out. And if air could get out, the wall wasn't a wall. It was a veil. She began to tap, not with the spoon, that was too loud. She used the pad of her thumb. It was a soft, rhythmic thrumming, exactly 2 hertz. It was the resonant frequency of the epoxy resin used to seal the seams in the late 90s. She wasn't trying to break the wall. She was trying to fatigue the chemical bonds of the glue. Every night for 6 months, she had tapped for 4 hours. Her thumb was calloused, the skin thickened into a hard, leather-like pad. She was a human jackhammer operating at a frequency so low it was felt rather than heard. "You hear that?" Ortiz asked, his voice suddenly sharp. "Hear what?" Miller replied. "That, I don't know, like a heartbeat in the floor." Elena stopped immediately. She melted back onto her cot, her body becoming as limp as a discarded rag. She controlled her breathing, slowing it down to 6 breaths per minute. Her heart rate, trained through years of high-stress SIGINT operations, dropped into the low 50s. "I don't hear nothing but your stomach growling," Miller grumbled. "Go get some crackers or something, you're jumpy." "I'm telling you, Sarge, this place gives me the creeps. It's too quiet. Even the crazy ones don't scream anymore. It's like they're waiting for something. They are waiting to die, Ortiz. They just don't know it yet." The door to the monitoring booth clicked shut. Elena waited. She counted 3,000 heartbeats, roughly 45 minutes. Then she stood back up. She didn't have much time. Sunsetting meant the colonel would be arriving within the next 48 hours. He would bring a team from the cleanup crew, men who didn't wear name tapes and didn't ask questions. They would use nitrogen gas, probably. It was clean, painless, and didn't leave marks on the bodies. They would pipe it through the ventilation, and by morning, Black Mountain would be empty. She reached into the waistband of her prison-issue trousers and pulled out a small, jagged piece of metal. It wasn't a shiv. It was a spring she had liberated from the underside of her cot 4 months ago. She had spent 100 nights grinding it against the floor until it was a precise, hooked tool. She didn't go for the door. She went for the light fixture. The light was a recessed LED unit protected by a Lexan shield and 4 security Torx bolts. The guards checked the shield every morning. They never checked the seal between the shield and the ceiling. Elena inserted the wire into the gap and began to fish. She wasn't looking for wires. She was looking for the vibration sensor. Most high-security facilities use seismic sensors to detect tunneling. If she hit the wall too hard, an alarm would trigger in the main security hub. But the sensors had a flaw. They were tuned to ignore the 60 Hz hum of the building's electrical system. Elena found the sensor's lead wire. She didn't cut it. Instead, she wrapped her spring around it and began to vibrate the wire at exactly 60 cycles per second. She became a bridge, a human transformer. She was feeding the sensor a ghost signal, a perfect loop of background noise that would mask any other vibration she made. With her other hand, she went back to the seam in the corner. She pressed her shoulder against the concrete and pushed. This was the dark competence that her instructors at the agency had always spoken of. It wasn't about strength. It was about the application of force at the exact moment the system was most vulnerable. She waited for the cooling fan to hit its wobble phase. Asterisk thump, thump, thump. Asterisk on the 4th thump, Elena surged. The epoxy, fatigued by months of 2 Hz tapping, finally gave way. There was no loud crack. There was only a soft, wet asterisk slurp asterisk as the vacuum seal between the concrete sleeve and the granite was broken. The panel, a section of concrete 2 feet wide and 6 feet high, shifted inward by ½ an inch. Elena exhaled, a long, slow hiss of air. Her muscles were screaming. The cost of 6 months of malnutrition and confinement was catching up to her. Her hands shook and she felt a cold sweat breaking across her forehead. She leaned her head against the cool stone and closed her eyes. She could smell it now. Not the recycled ozone-heavy air of the bunker. She could smell wet earth. She could smell the ponderosa pines. She could smell the Idaho wilderness. The void was real, but she couldn't just leave. The mission wasn't just her survival. The mission was the others. There was Captain Holloway in 408, a pilot who had seen something he shouldn't have during a ferry flight over the Nevada desert. There was Sarah Jenkins in 412, a civilian contractor who had discovered the financial trail of the Ethelgard project. And 12 others. If she left them, they were dead. And if she died trying to save them, the truth about Ethelgard would be buried under the mountain forever. She stepped back from the wall and pulled the panel back into place. It fit perfectly, the seam invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for a D-sharp resonance. She sat back down on her cot and waited for the morning light. At 0600, the dehumidifiers kicked on. At 0615, Miller and Ortiz were replaced by the day shift. Henderson and Vance, no relation, a coincidence that Elena found darkly humorous. At 0830, the breakfast trays were slid through the slots. Elena ate her lukewarm oatmeal with her plastic spoon. She watched the dust motes dancing in the sliver of light from the hallway. She looked like a woman who had finally surrendered to the void. Her eyes were dull, her posture slumped. Inside, she was a clock. She was calculating the patrol intervals. Henderson was lazy. He stayed in the booth and watched baseball highlights on a smuggled tablet. Vance was a runner. He liked to walk the perimeter of the wing every 20 minutes to keep his step count up on his fitness tracker. She needed a diversion, something that would draw both guards away from the booth for at least 90 seconds, and she needed to get to the central control panel. The opportunity came at 1045. A sound echoed through the wing. It wasn't a loud sound, but in the tomb-like silence of Black Mountain, it was a gunshot. It came from cell 410. It was the sound of a man hitting the floor. Elena knew 410. It was a man named David Miller, no relation to the guard, a former logistics officer who had been suffering from a worsening heart condition. The stress, the cold, and the lack of medication had finally triggered an event. Man down in 410. Henderson's voice crackled over the intercom. Elena watched through the small, reinforced window of her door. She saw Henderson and Vance run past. They were professionals, but they were bored professionals. They didn't call for medical team first. They went to the cell to see if he was faking it. It was a standard protocol to prevent feigned illness escapes, but it was also a fatal lapse in security. Elena didn't waste a second. She didn't have a key, but she didn't need one. She went to the light fixture. She had spent 6 months mapping the electrical grid. The lights in the cells were on a series circuit. If she could create a specific type of surge, a feedback loop, she could trick the emergency failsafe into thinking there was a fire in the wing. In a nuclear-hardened facility, a fire alarm didn't trigger sprinklers. It triggered a positive pressure event. The doors didn't lock down. They pulsed to allow for emergency egress while the halon gas suppressed the flames. It was a 5-second window designed to prevent personnel from being trapped in a vacuum. She took the spring from her waistband and shoved it into the LED housing, bridging the primary power lead to the ground wire of the sensor. The sparks were small, but the effect was immediate. The lights in cell 402 flickered, then died. A millisecond later, every light in the wing went to emergency red. The klaxon was a low-frequency moan that Elena felt in her teeth. Asterisk whump. Asterisk the magnetic locks on her door disengaged for exactly 5 seconds. Elena didn't run. She moved with a calculated, predatory grace. She pushed her door open, stepped into the hallway, and pulled the door shut behind her just as the locks re-engaged. To anyone looking at the control board, cell 402 was still secure. She was in the hall. The air felt different here, larger, colder. The red emergency lights cast long, rhythmic shadows. She moved toward the monitoring booth. Henderson and Vance were still at cell 410, trying to roll the unconscious prisoner onto his back. They were 50 feet away. She entered the booth. It smelled of stale popcorn and cheap aftershave. The monitors showed a grid of gray faces, the 14 prisoners, some sitting, some standing, all of them looking at their doors in confusion. Elena's fingers flew across the keyboard. She didn't know the passwords, but she knew the hardware. She reached under the console and found the manual override ribbon. It was a physical fail-safe, a bundle of copper wires that bypassed the software. She didn't cut them. She tuned them. By stripping the insulation and twisting 3 specific wires together, she created a permanent pulse state. Every door in the wing clicked. The green lights on the display began to flash in unison. "What the hell?" Vance's voice came from the hallway. He had seen the lights. Elena grabbed the master keys from the hook and a heavy maglite from the desk. She stepped out of the booth just as Vance turned the corner. He was a big man, 6'4", 230 pounds of corn-fed American muscle. He saw Elena, the broken woman from 402, standing in the middle of the red-lit hallway, and for a second his brain couldn't process the reality. "Vance," he stammered, reaching for his holster. Elena didn't wait for him to draw. She knew the frequency of a human jawbone. She stepped inside his reach, her movement a blur of efficiency, and drove the base of the maglite into the nerve cluster just below his ear. It wasn't a swing, it was a strike. The sound was like a dry branch snapping. Vance's eyes rolled back and his knees turned to water. She caught him before he hit the floor, easing his weight down so he wouldn't make a sound. Henderson was still in 410. He was shouting into his radio now, calling for backup. Elena moved to cell 408. She inserted the master key and threw the door open. Captain Holloway was sitting on the edge of his cot. He was a man of 50, his hair white, his eyes sharp even in the gloom. He looked at Elena, then at the guard's body in the hallway. "Chief," he whispered. Get up, Captain, Elena said, her voice a low, steady rasp. We're leaving. Or I let the rest of them out and I don't tell them to be nice. Henderson looked past her. 10 doors were open. 10 men and women, the ghosts of Black Mountain, were stepping into the hallway. They were gaunt, pale, and trembling, but they were looking at Henderson with an intensity that made his hand shake. He dropped the gun. Line up, Elena commanded. Single file, Holloway, you take the rear. If anyone falls, you pick them up. We have 6 minutes before the primary security team from the surface reaches the sublevel. Where are we going? Sarah Jenkins asked, her voice trembling. Elena pointed to the corner of cell 402. Through the mountain. They scrambled into her cell. It was a tight fit, 14 people squeezed into an 8x8 box. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and rising panic. The wall, Elena said, pointing to the seam. I need the strongest of you. On 3 we push, don't hit it. Constant pressure, use your legs. Holloway and 2 other men leaned their shoulders against the concrete panel. 1, 2, 3. The panel groaned. The epoxy screamed as it was torn apart. With a dull asterisk thud asterisk, the concrete slab fell backward, disappearing into the darkness of the void. A rush of cold, damp air flooded the cell. It was the smell of freedom, but it was also the smell of a long, dangerous climb. It's a 400-foot vertical ascent, Elena said, her voice echoing in the narrow space. There are rusted rebar rungs from the original construction. They haven't been tested in 60 years. If you lose your grip, there is no bottom. Follow me. Put your hands where I put mine. Listen to the stone. If it hums, it's solid. If it rattles, don't touch it. She stepped into the void. The space was barely 3 feet wide. To her left, the rough, jagged granite of the mountain. To her right, the smooth, cold back of the concrete bunker. It was a cathedral of shadow. She began to climb. Her fingers bled as she gripped the rusted iron rungs. Her muscles, weakened by months of inactivity, burned with a white-hot intensity. But she didn't stop. She felt the rhythm of the climb, asterisk reach. Grip, pull, step. Asterisk below her, she could hear the others. The heavy breathing, the clink of shoes against metal, the whispered prayers. They were halfway up when the mountain began to shake. It wasn't an earthquake. It was the elevator. The primary security team had arrived. Elena could hear the hum of the high-speed lift, a deep, mechanical growl that vibrated through the granite. They are in the wing, Holloway whispered from 10 feet below her. Keep moving, Elena said. They won't look for us here. They'll think we're hiding in the administrative vents. But then a new sound, a sound that made Elena stop dead in her tracks. It was a high-pitched whine like a jet engine spinning up. It was coming from the ventilation shafts that lined the void. Nitrogen, Elena hissed. The cleanup had started early. The colonel wasn't waiting for a head count. He was flooding the entire sublevel with gas. And because the void was connected to the ventilation array, the gas was being sucked upward, right toward them. We have to go faster, Sarah Jenkins cried out, her voice rising in a sob. Don't panic, Elena shouted, her voice cutting through the darkness. Panic changes your breathing. If you panic, you die in 3 minutes. If you stay calm, you have 10. Move now. She pushed herself harder. Her vision began to blur. The lack of oxygen was starting to take its toll. The nitrogen was invisible, odorless, and deadly. It didn't poison you, it just replaced the air until your brain simply forgot to tell your heart to beat. She felt the first wave of dizziness. The granite felt like it was shifting. The mountain was trying to push her off. Asterisk Steubenville, asterisk, she thought. Asterisk the sound of the river. The sound of the forge. Find the frequency. Asterisk she focused on the sound of the wind at the top of the shaft. It was a low, mournful whistle, a B-flat. She tuned her body to it. She became the wind. Her hand hit something cold and flat, a steel grate. She reached up and felt the bolts. They were rusted, fused to the frame by decades of mountain moisture. She couldn't turn them. She didn't have the strength. Below her, the climbing had stopped. Elena. Holloway's voice was weak, a mere shadow of a sound. I can't feel my hands. Elena looked up at the grate. She could see the stars through the mesh. They were so bright, so clear. They looked like diamonds scattered on black velvet. She wasn't going to die in a hole, not after Steubenville, not after 12 years of service, not after 6 months of tapping on a wall. She didn't use her hands. She positioned her back against the granite and her feet against the steel grate. She remembered the wobble of the fan. She remembered the way the building breathed. She began to vibrate her legs. It was a rhythmic, pulsing pressure timed to the natural resonance of the steel frame. Asterisk thump thump, thump thump. Asterisk she wasn't trying to break the bolts, she was trying to shear them. The nitrogen was thick now. Her lungs felt like they were filled with cotton. Her heart was a frantic drum in her chest. Asterisk one more, just one more. She gave a final, explosive shove, a scream of pure, controlled rage tearing from her throat. The bolt snapped. The grate flew upward, clattering onto the rocks above. A rush of freezing mountain air hit Elena in the face, a shock of pure oxygen that felt like a slap. She pulled herself out of the hole and collapsed onto the dirt. She took a deep, ragged breath, then another. The air tasted of pine and snow. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever tasted. She didn't rest. She reached back into the hole. "Holloway, give me your hand." She pulled them up one by one. They tumbled onto the mountain slope like newborn calves, gasping and shivering in the moonlight. 14 ghosts returned to the world of the living. They stood on a ridge overlooking the Idaho wilderness. Below them, hidden deep inside the mountain, the lights of the Black Mountain facility were a faint, artificial glow. "What now?" Sarah Jenkins asked, looking at the dark expanse of the forest. "They'll come for us. They have helicopters. They have thermal imaging." Elena looked toward the east. The first hint of dawn was beginning to bleed over the horizon, a thin line of bruised purple and gold. "No," Elena said, her voice steady and cold. "They won't come for us." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, black device she had taken from the monitoring booth. It wasn't a radio. It was the facility's emergency transponder. "I didn't just open the doors," Elena said. "I sent the facility's internal logs to every major news outlet and oversight committee in the country. By the time the sun is up, the Pentagon will be scrambling a containment team. But it won't be the colonel's team. It'll be the real army." She looked at the 14 people standing around her. They were broken, scarred, and exhausted. They had lost months of their lives to a shadow, but they were standing. "We walk toward the sunrise," Elena said. "We find a road, and then we tell them what happened inside that mountain." She turned and began to walk. Her feet were bare, her clothes were rags, and she was carrying the weight of a dozen lives on her shoulders. But as she moved through the trees, she wasn't listening to the mountain anymore. She was listening to the sound of her own footsteps. They were firm. They were rhythmic. They were the sound of a woman who was no longer a ghost. Behind her, the mountain was silent. The door she had found, the flaw in the stone, the mistake in the concrete, was still there, a jagged hole in the earth. The guards would find it eventually. They would look at the concrete panel and the rusted rungs, and they would wonder how a broken woman had seen what they were blind to. They would never understand that Elena Vance hadn't escaped because she found a door. She had escaped because she had never truly let them lock her in. The first rays of the sun hit the ridge, turning the pine needles to gold. Elena didn't look back. She kept her eyes on the horizon, counting the frequency of the new day. It was a perfect, resonant C major, and for the first time in 6 months, Elena Vance smiled. The smile didn't last longer than the time it took for the first mountain breeze to hit the sweat-soaked collar of Elena's prison jumpsuit. It was a fleeting, fragile thing, a muscle memory of a woman who had once believed that a problem solved was a victory won. But as the sun's warmth touched her skin, it also illuminated the stark, terrifying reality of the 14 people huddled around her on the jagged spine of the Bitterroot Range. They were ghosts in the light, their skin the color of damp parchment, their eyes wide and flickering with a frantic animal terror that the open sky only seemed to amplify. The silence of the mountain wasn't the peaceful quiet of a postcard. It was the heavy, expectant silence of a vacuum waiting to be filled. Elena turned her head, her ears straining against the roar of the wind. She wasn't looking for the view. She was listening for the dissonance. She heard the wind whistling through the ponderosa pines, a clean, sharp B-flat. She heard the distant rush of a meltwater stream 1,000 feet below in the valley, a low-frequency rumble that felt like a pulse. And then she heard it, the rhythmic, percussive thud of a rotor. It was faint, miles away to the southwest, but the frequency was wrong. A standard Army Black Hawk had a distinct 4-blade signature, a heavy, rhythmic asterisk wop 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 asterisk. This was faster, thinner, the sound of a 5-blade system. A civilian pattern MD-500 or perhaps an MH-6 Little Bird stripped of its markings and muffled by a high-end exhaust kit. It wasn't a rescue, it was a sweep. "Chief," Holloway said, his voice cracking as he stepped toward her. He was leaning heavily on a piece of deadwood he'd scavenged, his flight suit hanging off his skeletal frame like a shroud. "The transponder. You said the real army would be coming." Elena looked down at the small black device in her hand. The LED was still pulsing a steady, mocking blue. She had spent 6 months mapping the internal logic of the Black Mountain facility, but she had been working with a map drawn by the people who built the cage. She realized, with a cold, sinking weight in her gut, that she had assumed the emergency protocol was designed to save the facility from the outside world. She hadn't considered that it might be designed to save the outside world from the facility. "The logs," Elena said, her voice barely a whisper, yet carrying with the clarity of a bell in the thin air. "I sent them through the primary emergency uplink. It's a dedicated military frequency, 225, 0 megahertz. It's supposed to bypass local encryption." "Supposed to," Holloway repeated. He looked out over the valley, his eyes narrowing as he spotted the same speck on the horizon that Elena's ears had already categorized. "But Ethelgard isn't just a contractor, Elena. They're a shadow. If they own the mountain, they own the air above it." "They don't own the physics," Elena snapped, the controlled rage flickering back to life. She didn't have time for despair. Despair was a low-frequency emotion. It was slow and heavy, and it got people killed. "The signal went out, but the transponder. It's not just a beacon for the logs, it's a tether. They're tracking the source." She looked at the survivors. Sarah Jenkins was shivering violently, her hands wrapped around her thin arms. David Miller, the man whose heart had almost stopped in cell 410, was pale, his breathing shallow. They were a liability. In a tactical sense, they were drag. If she were a different kind of soldier, the kind the colonel thought she was, she would leave them. She would disappear into the timber, use her knowledge of the terrain to mask her acoustic signature, and be across the state line by nightfall. But Elena Vance didn't leave her gear behind, and she didn't leave her people. "We move," Elena commanded. "Down the north slope, stay under the canopy. If you hear the bird get louder, you drop. Don't look up. The glass on those cockpits is treated to pick up the glint of a human eye from a mile out. Move like the mountain." "We can't walk to civilization, Chief," one of the men groaned. He was a former logistics officer named Kessler. "We're 20 miles from the nearest paved road. We're in rags. We're starving." Elena stepped toward him. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. She stood just inside his personal space, her presence as solid as the granite beneath them. "Kessler, look at me. 6 months ago, you were a ghost. 10 minutes ago, you were supposed to be a corpse. Right now, you're a man standing in the sun. If you want to stay that way, you move your feet. If you want to die, stay on the ridge and wait for the men in the black helicopter to explain their retirement plan to you." Kessler looked at her, his jaw working, then he looked at the approaching speck in the sky. He nodded once, a sharp, jerky movement. The descent was a slow-motion nightmare of physical pain and sensory calculation. Elena took the lead, her bare feet finding the purchase in the loose scree that others missed. She wasn't just walking, she was sensing the ground. She felt the vibrations of the mountain, the way the earth absorbed the sound of their movement. She directed them to walk on the moss-covered rocks and the thick mats of fallen needles, avoiding the dry branches and the hollow-sounding pockets of shale. To the others, it was a desperate scramble for survival. To Elena, it was a symphony of concealment. She was tuning their escape, trying to find a way to make 14 people sound like nothing more than the wind moving through the brush. Holloway stayed at the rear, the 1911 he'd taken from the guard tucked into his waistband. He and Elena moved in a silent, practiced synchronicity that hadn't needed to be taught. They were the only ones who knew the real cost of the silence. Every time a survivor stumbled, every time a stone rolled down the slope with a sharp, clattering asterisk, clack asterisk, Elena felt it in her teeth. It was a flare, a signal to the hunters above. "Chief," Holloway whispered during a brief pause under a dense stand of subalpine fir. He was sweating despite the cold, his face gray. "The bird is circling. They've lost the transponder signal, but they know the radius." Elena had buried the transponder under a 300-pound slab of granite 500 yards back, hoping the stone's mineral content would dampen the signal enough to buy them time. "They'll search the ridge first. They'll expect us to go for the high ground to get a signal out. We're doing the opposite. We're going into the throat of the valley." "The drainage?" Holloway asked, his brow furrowing. "That's a dead end. It leads to the reservoir. They'll have a perimeter there within the hour." "The reservoir is the obvious end," Elena said. She sat down, not because she was tired, but because she needed to be closer to the earth. She pressed her palms into the dirt. "But there's an old logging flume. It hasn't been on a map since the 70s. My father worked a contract up here when I was a kid. He told me about the way the water sounded when it hit the old cedar supports. It was a hollow, ringing sound, like a bell." "You're betting our lives on a memory of a sound your dad told you about 30 years ago?" Holloway asked. There was no judgment in his voice, only the tired curiosity of a man who had already accepted his death. "I'm betting our lives on the fact that the flume is made of old-growth cedar," Elena corrected. Cedar doesn't rot like pine, and it's built into a natural crevasse. If we can reach it, we disappear, not just from their eyes, but from their thermal. The water from the snowmelt is 40 degrees. It'll mask our heat signatures. They moved again, the gradient becoming steeper, the air thicker and more humid as they descended toward the valley floor. The sensory environment was changing. The sharp, clean notes of the ridge were being replaced by the complex, damp textures of the old-growth forest. Elena could smell the rot of fallen logs, the sweet, heavy scent of damp earth, and the metallic tang of the mountain stream. But she could also smell something else. Something that didn't belong, aviation fuel. "Stop!" Elena hissed. The line of survivors froze. Behind her, she heard the ragged breath of Sarah Jenkins, the soft thud of Holloway's boot. Elena closed her eyes. She ignored the sound of the wind. She ignored the pounding of her own heart. She narrowed her focus to the space 50 yards ahead where the trees thinned near a rocky outcrop. She heard it. The soft, rhythmic asterisk, tick-tick-tick asterisk of a cooling engine. The smell of JP-8 was stronger now, carried on the thermal updrafts from the valley. "They didn't just send one bird," Elena whispered. "The scout," Holloway said, his hand moving to the grip of the pistol. "They've got a ground team, they've leapfrogged us." Elena didn't move. She was visualizing the geometry of the woods. The cooling engine was to the east. The wind was blowing from the north. If they moved west, they would be upwind, their scent carried straight to the hunters. If they stayed put, the helicopter on the ridge would eventually expand its search and find them. "How many?" Holloway asked. "One engine," Elena said. "Small, a turbine, maybe a light utility vehicle or a bike, but there are footsteps, 4 sets, Vibram soles, military gate. They're not searching, they're waiting." The institutional failure she had sensed in the mountain was now taking a physical form. This wasn't a standard military search and rescue operation. There were no shouts of U.S. Army, identify yourself. There were no flares. There was only the quiet, professional silence of a kill team. The system hadn't failed by accident. It had been weaponized. The people who were supposed to be her brothers in arms were now the predators, and she was the asset that needed to be liquidated. "We have to go through them," Elena said. "Chief, look at us," Holloway said, gesturing to the shivering, broken group. "We can't fight a fire team, we don't even have shoes." "We're not going to fight them," Elena said. She looked at Sarah Jenkins. "Sarah, I need your sweater." The woman blinked, confused, but she pulled off the thin, gray wool garment. Elena took it and began to shred it into strips. "What are you doing?" Kessler asked. "I'm changing the frequency," Elena said. She took the strips of wool and began to tie them around the feet of the 4 strongest survivors, including Holloway. "The Vibram soles the hunters are wearing have a specific impact signature. It's a sharp, heavy strike. If we wrap our feet in this wool and step on the softest parts of the moss, we'll sound like deer. The human brain is wired to ignore animal sounds in the woods. We're going to walk right past them." "And the rest of us?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "You stay here," Elena said. "Holloway and I are going to create a ghost. When you hear the sound of a tree falling to the east, you move west. Don't run, walk like you're part of the wind. If you hear anything else, you stay down and you don't breathe until the sun goes down." "Elena," Holloway said, his voice low, "if this doesn't work." "It works, Captain. Physics doesn't have an opinion, it just has rules." Elena and Holloway moved off into the brush. Elena moved with a terrifying, fluid grace, her body low to the ground, her senses projected outward like a sonar array. She wasn't just looking for the enemy. She was looking for the weakness in the environment. She found it in a towering, dead hemlock that was leaning at a precarious 30-degree angle against a granite boulder. The tree was Widowmaker, a structural failure waiting to happen. The base was rotted, held in place by a single, strained root and the friction of the rock. Elena knelt at the base of the tree. She didn't use a tool. She used her hands to clear the duff away from the root. She could hear the tension in the wood, a high-pitched, microscopic groaning that most people would never notice. "On my signal," she whispered to Holloway. "I need you to fire one shot into the granite, not the tree, the rock." Holloway nodded, his eyes fixed on her. In that moment, in the dim, green light of the Idaho forest, the relationship between them was solidified. It wasn't born of rank or time. It was the specific love between 2 people who had seen the abyss and decided to build a bridge over it. Holloway didn't ask her how a single shot would bring down a tree. He just waited. Elena placed her ear against the hemlock. She was waiting for the helicopter on the ridge to make its next pass. The sound of the rotors would provide the necessary vibration to mask the tree's final collapse. The thud of the 5-blade system grew louder. The air began to vibrate. Now, Elena commanded. Holloway fired. The crack of the .45 was swallowed by the roar of the helicopter overhead. The bullet struck the granite boulder, sending a shockwave through the stone. Elena surged against the tree, her shoulder hitting the rotted base at the exact millisecond the vibration from the helicopter hit its peak. The hemlock groaned, a deep guttural sound, and then it gave way. It crashed through the underbrush, 100 feet of dead timber slamming into the forest floor with a sound that echoed through the valley like a localized earthquake. To the kill team 50 yards away, it was a massive, sudden impact. It was the sound of something or someone moving with great force. "Go!" Elena hissed. They didn't wait to see the results. They circled back to the survivors and began the westward movement. They moved like shadows, their wool-wrapped feet making no more sound than the falling needles. As they crested a small rise, Elena caught a glimpse of the kill team. They were exactly what she had expected. 4 men in matte gray tactical gear, no insignia, carrying suppressed MCX rifles. They were moving toward the fallen tree with a disciplined, aggressive posture. They were professionals, but they were looking for a person. They weren't looking for a frequency. The survivors slipped past them, a line of ghosts moving through the deep shadows of the gully. 2 hours later, they reached the flume. It was exactly as Elena's father had described it. A massive, weathered wooden trough, 6 feet wide, carved into the side of the canyon wall. It was a relic of an era when the mountains were seen as something to be conquered, a skeleton of industry that had been reclaimed by the moss and the ferns. The water inside was a rushing, white-capped torrent of snowmelt, the sound a continuous, high-decibel roar that drowned out everything else. "Get in," Elena said. "Chief, we'll freeze," Kessler protested, looking at the churning water. "Better to freeze for an hour than to be buried in a hole forever," Elena said. She didn't wait for him. She stepped into the flume. The cold was an immediate physical blow. It felt like 1,000 needles piercing her skin. Her breath left her in a sharp, painful gasp. But as she submerged herself to the neck, she felt the mask settle over her. The sound of the water was a perfect white noise, a chaotic jumble of frequencies that would defeat any directional microphone. The temperature of her body dropped, her thermal signature vanishing into the cold embrace of the mountain. One by one, the others followed. They clung to the cedar supports, their faces pale and pinched with cold, their bodies shaking. Holloway was the last one in. He looked at Elena, his teeth chattering, and gave a small, grim nod. They drifted down the flume, the water carrying them deeper into the heart of the wilderness. For the first time in 6 months, Elena Vance wasn't listening to walls. She was listening to the water, and in the roar of the flume she heard something new. It wasn't a frequency of weakness. It was the frequency of a choice. She had sent the logs. She had triggered the beacon. But the real army hadn't come. That meant the failure wasn't just at Black Mountain. It was at the Pentagon. It was in the very heart of the institution she had served her entire life. Ethelgard wasn't a shadow. It was the new reality. As the flume carried them around a sharp bend in the canyon, the forest opened up, revealing a wide, paved highway stretching through the valley floor below. A few miles to the north, the lights of a small town began to flicker on as the sun dipped behind the western peaks. "We made it," Sarah Jenkins sobbed, her voice barely audible over the water. "There's a town, there's a road." Elena didn't look at the town. She was looking at a black SUV parked on the shoulder of the highway. Beside it stood a man in a dark suit, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the mountain they had just descended. He wasn't a soldier, he was an executive, a cleaner. The institutional failure was complete. The road to the town was a trap, the highway was a net. Elena reached out and grabbed a low-hanging branch, stopping her momentum in the water. One by one, the others bumped into her, their eyes wide with confusion. "We're not going to the town," Elena said. "Why not?" Kessler demanded, his voice rising in panic. "We're right there. We can find a phone, we can." "Look at the car, Kessler," Elena said. She pointed to the black SUV. On the rear bumper was a small, inconspicuous sticker, a stylized eagle with its wings curved into a claw, the Ethelgard logo. "They're not just at the mountain," Holloway whispered, his face pale. "They're everywhere." The realization hit the group like a physical blow. The hope that had sustained them through the climb and the cold evaporated, replaced by a crushing, absolute despair. They were 14 people in rags, standing in a freezing wooden trough, surrounded by an enemy that owned the very roads they needed to escape. "What do we do, Chief?" Holloway asked. He was looking at her. They were all looking at her. They didn't see a prisoner anymore. They didn't see a broken woman. They saw the only person in the world who knew how to hear the weakness in the machine. Elena Vance looked at the black SUV. She felt the cold of the water in her bones. She felt the hunger and the exhaustion and the jagged edge of the betrayal. But she also felt something else. A dark, quiet competence that had been forged in the steel mills of Ohio and tempered in the black sights of the Army. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the piece of metal she had used to bypass the sensor in her cell, the sharpened spring. She looked at it, then she looked at the heavy cedar support beam of the flume. "We're not going to the town," Elena said, her voice a low, steady rasp. "We're going back to the source." "Back," Sarah gasped. "To the mountain." "Not the mountain," Elena said. "The node, Ethelgard, has a regional data center in Coeur d'Alene. It's where the dead drop filter is located. It's why my logs didn't reach the Pentagon. If we can reach that center, we don't just send the logs, we burn the entire network from the inside out." "That's suicide," Kessler said. "We don't have weapons. We don't have a vehicle. We don't have a plan." Elena looked at him, her eyes as cold as the mountain water. "We have the frequency, Kessler, and in a world built on signals, the person who knows the frequency owns the world." She turned to Holloway. "Captain, how good are you at hot wiring a Chevy Suburban?" Holloway's mouth twitched into something that might have been a smile if his face hadn't been so frozen. "I'm a pilot, Chief. If it has an ignition and a fuel pump, I can make it fly." "Good," Elena said. She stepped out of the flume, her bare feet hitting the damp earth with a solid, resonant thud. "Because we're going to steal that car, and then we're going to show Ethelgard what happens when you try to bury a Vance." The decision had been made. The line had been crossed. Elena Vance was no longer a ghost, and she was no longer a prisoner. She was a weapon, recalibrated and aimed at the heart of the system that had tried to erase her. They began the final descent toward the highway, 14 shadows moving through the twilight. They didn't move like victims anymore. They moved with the quiet, terrifying purpose of people who had nothing left to lose but their silence. As they reached the edge of the woods, 50 yards from the parked SUV, Elena stopped. She knelt down and pressed her ear to the ground. She heard the sound of the highway, the distant hum of tires on asphalt. But she also heard something else. A vibration coming from the SUV itself. A low-frequency thrum that wasn't an engine. It was a satellite uplink. The man in the suit was receiving a transmission. Elena closed her eyes, her mind mapping the signal. It was an encrypted burst, 12.5 gigahertz, high speed, high security. And then she heard the voice. Not through the air, but through the ground, the vibration of the man's voice traveling through his boots and into the earth. "Target identified," the man said. Elena's heart didn't spike, but the pressure in her chest became a hard, cold knot. "The chief is on the north slope," the man continued. "The sweep team missed her, but we have her on the long-range thermal. She's leading a group of 14. Permission to engage with extreme prejudice." There was a pause. Elena waited, her breath held. "Understood," the man said. "We'll make it look like a tragic accident, a forest fire in the drainage. Nobody survives a burn like that." Elena stood up. She looked at Holloway. "They're going to burn the valley," she whispered. Even as she said it, she heard the first sound of the incendiary charges. A series of soft, muffled asterisk pops asterisk from the ridge above them. Ethelgard wasn't just hunting them anymore. They were erasing the evidence by destroying the mountain itself. "We have 3 minutes," Elena said. "Holloway, take Kessler and the 2 others, go for the car. I'll provide the distraction." "Elena, no," Holloway said, grabbing her arm. "You can't go out there alone." "I'm not going alone," Elena said, her eyes fixed on the man in the suit. "I'm going with the wind." She didn't wait for his response. She vanished into the tall grass near the shoulder of the road. The man in the suit was leaning against the hood of the SUV, his eyes on the mountain. He didn't see the grass part. He didn't hear the soft, rhythmic tapping on the asphalt. Elena was moving at a frequency that matched the hum of the highway. She was a ghost in the machine. She reached the rear of the vehicle. She didn't go for the man. She went for the fuel tank. She took the sharpened spring and pressed it against the plastic housing of the fuel line. She didn't cut it. She began to vibrate the metal, a high-frequency sawing motion that was so fast it was silent. The plastic gave way. A thin stream of JP8 began to spray onto the hot exhaust pipe. The man in the suit turned, his nose wrinkling. "What the—" He didn't finish the sentence. Elena stepped out from behind the vehicle. She was covered in mud, her hair matted, her eyes burning with a dark, terrible light. "Your signal is out of phase," she said. The man reached for his holster, but he was too slow. Elena didn't hit him with her fist. She hit him with the maglite she had taken from the bunker, a single, precise strike to the carotid sinus. The man's nervous system overloaded. He collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut. Elena grabbed the keys from his belt and tossed them to Holloway, who had just emerged from the brush. "Get them in!" Elena shouted. The survivors scrambled into the SUV, a frantic, desperate pile of humanity. Holloway slid into the driver's seat, the engine roaring to life with a defiant growl, but Elena didn't get in. She stood on the shoulder of the road, looking back at the mountain. The first orange glow of the forest fire was beginning to crest the ridge. The cleanup had begun. "Elena, get in!" Holloway yelled. Elena looked at the man on the ground. She looked at the satellite uplink on the roof of the SUV. She reached out and ripped the antenna from its mount. "They're still tracking us," Elena said. "The car has a low jack. If we take it, they'll find us in 10 minutes. "Then we're dead anyway," Kessler screamed from the back seat. "No," Elena said. She looked down the highway. A mile away, a massive semi-truck was barreling toward them, its headlights cutting through the twilight. It was a fuel tanker, the words *Northwest Petroleum* emblazoned on the side. Elena knew that truck. She knew the frequency of the engine, a Cummins ISX-15. She knew the vibration of the liquid in the tank. "Holloway, drive," Elena commanded. "Follow that truck. Stay exactly 6 feet behind his rear bumper." "Why?" "Aerodynamic drafting," Elena said. "If you stay in his slipstream, the radar signature of this SUV will be swallowed by the truck's mass. To the satellite, we'll look like a single vehicle, a ghost in the shadow of a giant." Holloway didn't hesitate. He slammed the SUV into gear and floored it. Elena leaped into the passenger seat just as the vehicle lurched forward. They accelerated down the highway, the black SUV tucking itself behind the massive tanker like a pilot fish on a shark. Behind them, the mountain was beginning to glow with a hellish orange light. The valley was burning. Elena Vance sat in the passenger seat, her hands gripped tight on the dashboard. She looked at her reflection in the side mirror. She was covered in the soot of her own erasure. She was a woman who had been killed, buried, and forgotten. But as the truck carried them toward Coeur d'Alene, Elena felt the vibration of the road beneath her. It was a steady, rhythmic pulse, a heartbeat. She wasn't just surviving, she was calibrating. The SUV's radio crackled to life, a burst of static that slowly resolved into a voice. It wasn't a news report. It was a secure channel. "Ethelgard actual to sweep one. Report status on the assets." Elena reached out and turned the dial. She didn't turn it off. She tuned it to the frequency of the satellite uplink she had ripped from the roof. "Sweep 1 is dark," Elena said into the microphone, her voice cold and absolute. "The assets are gone and the frequency is changing." There was a long, terrible silence on the other end of the radio. "Who is this?" the voice asked, a tremor of fear finally breaking through the professional facade. Elena Vance looked at the road ahead, where the lights of the city were beginning to rise out of the darkness like a new mountain. "This is the sound of the wall breaking," Elena said. She clicked the radio off. In the back seat, the survivors were silent. They were looking at her with a mixture of awe and terror. They had seen what she was capable of. They had seen the dark competence that lay beneath the surface of the broken woman. Holloway looked at her, his eyes reflecting the glow of the dashboard lights. "We're going to the data center, aren't we?" "Yes," Elena said. "And then what?" Elena looked at her calloused thumb, the skin still vibrating with the memory of the 2 hertz tap. "Then," Elena said, "we find the frequency of the entire system, and we turn the volume up until the world hears what's happening inside that mountain." As they neared the city limits, a fleet of black sedans began to emerge from the side streets, their sirens silent but their purpose clear. They weren't police. They were the cleanup crew, mobilized and desperate. The tanker truck began to slow down as it approached a way station. "They're waiting for us," Holloway said, his voice tight. Elena looked at the way station. She looked at the massive steel girders of the overpass above it. She closed her eyes. She listened to the resonance of the bridge. "Don't slow down, Captain," Elena said. "Elena, there's a roadblock." "Trust the physics, Holloway," Elena said. "Aim for the 3rd pylon at exactly 64 miles per hour." Holloway gripped the wheel, his knuckles white. He looked at the roadblock, a line of armored SUVs and men with rifles. He looked at the steel pylon. 64, he whispered. He floored the accelerator. The SUV surged forward, breaking away from the tanker. The men at the roadblock leveled their weapons. The world narrowed down to a single point of impact. Elena Vance leaned forward, her hand pressing against the glass of the windshield. She wasn't afraid. She was focused. She was the conductor of a symphony that was about to reach its crescendo. The sound of the engine rose to a scream. The pylon loomed large. The world was a blur of steel and light. And then, just as the SUV was about to hit the pylon, Elena reached out and slammed her palm against the dashboard at the exact frequency of the bridge's harmonic resonance. The pylon didn't break. The bridge didn't fall. But for one impossible second, the entire structure vibrated with a force that shattered every window in the roadblock subs and sent a shockwave of sound through the air that knocked every man to his knees. The black SUV tore through the gap, a ghost passing through a wall of sound. They were through. But as Elena looked in the rearview mirror, she saw a single matte black helicopter rising from the city's skyline, its searchlight cutting through the night like a vengeful eye. It wasn't over. The escalation had only just begun. "Chief," Holloway said, his voice trembling with adrenaline. "We've got company." Elena looked at the helicopter. She looked at the city ahead. "I know," she said. "I've been waiting for them to join the song." She reached into the man's pocket, the man they had left on the road, and pulled out a small, encrypted thumb drive. It was the key to the Ethelgard network. She looked at it, and for the first time since the mountain, her eyes softened. Not with warmth, but with the cold, hard light of a woman who finally saw the end of the road. The cost was coming. She could feel it in the air. A sacrifice was required to break a system this large. She looked at Holloway. "Captain, I'm going to need you to do something for me, something that isn't on any flight manual." Holloway looked at her, and in that moment he knew exactly what she was asking. He knew the cost, and he knew with a certainty that transcended rank or duty that he would pay it. "Anything, Chief," he said. Elena Vance nodded. She turned her gaze back to the city, the dark competence settling over her like a suit of armor. The data center was 3 miles away. The helicopter was 1 mile away. The countdown had begun, and in the heart of the city, the walls were already starting to groan. The copper tang of old blood was still coating Elena's tongue when she pressed her thumb against the sub's dashboard, feeling the frantic 400 hertz stutter of the alternator fighting to keep up with the demands of the stolen satellite uplink. They were 3 miles south of the Coeur d'Alene city limits, the speedometer needle hovering at a shaky 90, and the heavy smell of JP8 fuel from the mountain was being replaced by the acrid scent of overheating brake pads and the stale, recycled air of a vehicle that had seen too many miles. Outside, the Idaho landscape was a blur of dark pines and the shimmering, deceptive piece of the moonlight on the lake. But inside the Suburban, the air was thick with the rhythmic, shallow breathing of 14 people who had forgotten how to be alive. Elena didn't look back at them. She couldn't afford the weight of their hope. She kept her eyes on the road and her mind on the frequency, waiting for the moment the vibration of the pavement changed from the open-throated roar of the highway to the choppy, interrupted rhythm of an urban grid. The helicopter was no longer just a sound. It was a physical pressure, a low-frequency thrum that vibrated in Elena's molars and made the glass of the side mirrors jitter in their housings. It was an MH6 little bird, light and nimble, the kind of bird that could land on a rooftop or hover 10 feet off the asphalt to let a sniper take a clean shot. She could hear the turbines whine, a high-pitched predatory whistle, and she knew the pilot was playing with them, waiting for the moment they hit the city lights to turn the chase into a televised execution. "Holloway," Elena said, her voice like a whetstone on steel. "The bridge is coming up. The North Idaho Centennial Trail overpass. It's a box girder design, steel. When we pass under it, I need you to kill the lights and hard brake. Do not stop, just drop 40 miles per hour in 2 seconds. Holloway didn't look at her. He didn't ask why. His hands were fused to the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the gray leather. "Copy that, Chief. 300 yards, 200. "Wait for the hum," Elena whispered, her eyes closing. She felt it before she saw it. The massive, hollow resonance of the bridge as they approached. Every structure had a natural frequency, a song it sang when the wind or the traffic hit it just right. The overpass was humming at 14 hertz, a frequency just below human hearing but loud enough to rattle the sensors of a pursuing aircraft. "Now!" The world went pitch black as Holloway cut the lights. The SUV groaned as the brakes clamped down, the tires screaming in a brief, agonizing protest before the vehicle ducked into the deep shadow of the bridge. Above them, the little bird's searchlight swept the empty road ahead, the pilot blinded by the sudden transition and the infrared scatter caused by the bridge's massive steel heat signature. "Left on the service road," Elena commanded. "Kill the engine, coast." Holloway threw the wheel over. The SUV bounced off the shoulder, gravel clattering against the undercarriage like a spray of gunfire. They drifted into a thicket of scrub oak and willow, the engine dying with a soft, mechanical sigh. Silence fell over them, but it was a violent silence. In the back, Kessler was sobbing quietly, a jagged, rhythmic sound that Elena wanted to cut out of the air. She stayed perfectly still, her head tilted, listening. Above, the helicopter roared past, the downdraft of its rotors shaking the branches of the willows. The searchlight slashed through the trees 50 yards to their right, a bright, inquisitive finger of light that found nothing but dirt and shadow. "They'll circle back," Holloway whispered, his breath hitching. "We have maybe 2 minutes before they realize we didn't come out the other side." "We're not staying," Elena said. She reached into the footwell and pulled out the black tactical bag she'd liberated from the SUV's previous owner. Inside were 4 flashbangs, 2 smoke canisters, and a compact, suppressed Sig Sauer MCX. She checked the chamber by feel alone, the sliding of the bolt a familiar, comforting note in the dark. "Sarah, Kessler, everyone out, now! Out!" Kessler hissed, his voice cracking. "We're in the middle of nowhere. If we leave the car, they'll hunt us down like dogs." Elena turned in the seat. She didn't use her rank. She didn't use a threat. She simply looked at Kessler with eyes that had seen the inside of a box for 6 months and found the weakness in the light. "The car is a beacon. It's got an integrated cellular link and a GPS transponder that I've only partially jammed. In 60 seconds, this vehicle is going to be the center of a kill zone. If you want to be in it, stay put. If you want to live, follow the captain into the drainage ditch." She didn't wait for a consensus. She kicked the door open and stepped out into the cool night air. The smell of the lake was stronger here, damp, mossy, and old. She looked at Holloway as he led the shivering survivors into the deep shadow of the concrete culvert. "Where are you going?" Holloway asked, his hand catching her sleeve for a brief, desperate second. "The data center is a mile to the east," Elena said. She looked at the city skyline where the Ethelgard logo, that stylized, predatory eagle, glowed in blue neon atop a nondescript 6-story building. "I'm going to give them something else to look at. Stay in the culvert. Move only when you hear the sirens, not the police, the fire trucks. When the fire trucks start moving, you head for the marina. Find a boat with a blue hull. The key will be under the starboard cushion. It belongs to a man named Miller who doesn't know he's retired yet." "Elena," Holloway said, his voice dropping an octave, "you're acting without authorization. If you do this, there is no coming back. The logs you sent. They can be buried, but this is permanent." "It was permanent the moment they turned the mountain into a grave, Captain," she said. She reached out and squeezed his hand, a short, singular moment of human contact that felt like a spark in a dark room. "Go, now." She watched them disappear into the earth, a line of ghosts led by a man who was still trying to remember how to be a hero. Then she turned back to the SUV. She didn't need a bomb. She didn't need a timer. She needed the frequency. She opened the hood of the Suburban and found the main wiring harness. She took the sharpened spring from her pocket and pierced the insulation of the high-tension lead to the ignition coil. Then she took the man's satellite phone and stripped the charging cable. She bridged the two, creating a feedback loop between the vehicle's electrical system and the high-frequency transmitter of the phone. She stepped back and threw a single smoke canister into the cabin of the SUV. As the thick, gray clouds began to pour out of the windows, she hit the send button on the phone, dialing a ghost number she had memorized years ago. The feedback loop triggered. The SUV's electronics didn't just fail, they began to scream. The radio, the GPS, the cellular link, they all began to broadcast a massive, distorted pulse of electromagnetic noise, a shout that would look like a catastrophic hardware failure and a desperate distress signal to every sensor in the sky. Elena didn't stay to watch. She sprinted toward the tree line, her bare feet hitting the ground in a rhythmic 3-beat pattern that minimized her acoustic signature. She was 100 yards away when the little bird returned. The pilot saw the smoke. He saw the massive EM flare on his sensors. He saw the target stationary and vulnerable. He didn't hesitate. The sound of the M134 minigun was not the sound of a gun. It was the sound of the air being torn in half. A deep, mechanical asterisk BRRRRRRRT asterisk that turned the SUV into a fountain of sparks and shredded metal. In the darkness, the tracers looked like a solid beam of red light, a finger of God reaching down to erase the evidence. Elena didn't look back. She used the roar of the gun to mask her own movement, crossing the open field toward the perimeter fence of the Ethelgard Regional Data Center. The fence was 10 feet of chain link topped with razor wire, pulsed with a 5 kilovolt current. Elena didn't look for a gate. She didn't look for a weak spot. She knelt at the base of a steel support post and pressed her ear to the metal. She heard the hum of the security system, a steady 60 hertz cycle. But beneath it, she heard the stutter. Ethelgard was using a multiplex sensor array, a system that checked the integrity of the fence every 2 seconds. It was a sophisticated, high-end setup, but it relied on a synchronized clock. Elena pulled a small, heavy-duty magnet from her bag, a component she'd ripped from the sub's speaker. She waited. 1, 2, 3. On the 4th second, she slapped the magnet against the post and jumped. She cleared the wire with an inch to spare, her jumpsuit snagging briefly on a barb, the fabric tearing with a sharp *zip* that was lost in the distant sound of the burning SUV. She landed on the manicured lawn inside the perimeter, the grass cool and damp against her feet. The building was a fortress of glass and steel, designed to look like a high-end corporate office but built with the structural integrity of a bunker. There were no windows on the first 3 floors. The air was filled with the low-frequency drone of the cooling towers, a massive, rhythmic thrum that processed the heat from the thousands of servers inside. Elena moved toward the loading dock. She didn't go for the doors. Doors were monitored by weight sensors and infrared cameras. She went for the vents. She found a secondary intake louver 6 feet off the ground. She could feel the vibration of the fans behind the steel slats, a high-speed 3,600 RPM whine. It was a deadly, spinning wall of blades, but Elena wasn't looking at the blades. She was looking at the mounting bolts. The fan was slightly out of balance. It was a microscopic flaw, a fraction of a millimeter of play in the bearing, but to Elena, it was a drumbeat. The vibration was traveling through the steel frame at a frequency of 58 hertz. She took the suppressed MCX and jammed the barrel into the gap between the slats, wedging it against the frame. She didn't fire, she just held it there, adding her own weight to the vibration. The frequency changed. The 58 hertz climbed to 60, matching the cycle of the building's power grid. Harmonic resonance is a quiet killer. The fan didn't explode, it simply began to shake itself apart. The mounting bolts, stressed by the synchronized vibration, began to back out of their sockets. Within 30 seconds, the entire assembly shifted, the blades clipping the housing with a series of sharp, metallic *clacks*. The system's internal sensors registered a catastrophic mechanical failure and automatically cut the power to the intake fan to prevent a fire. The blades slowed to a halt. Elena pulled the slats open and slid into the darkness. The interior of the duct was a world of galvanized steel and the smell of ozone and dust. She crawled through the narrow space, her heart a steady, controlled rhythm in her chest. She was moving toward the brain of the building, the network operations center. This was the crossing. She was no longer a soldier on a mission. She was an insurgent in the belly of the beast. There was no authorization for what she was about to do. There was no rules of engagement for a woman who had been erased by her own country. She reached a junction in the ductwork and looked through the grate. Below her was the server farm, a vast, echoing cathedral of black cabinets and blinking blue lights. The air was frigid, kept at a constant 68 degrees, and the sound was a continuous, mind-numbing roar of white noise. In the center of the room, a glass-walled enclosure housed the primary routers. The filter, where her logs were currently being decrypted and deleted. 2 guards in gray tactical gear stood at the entrance, their MCX rifles slung low, their eyes scanning the room with the bored precision of men who didn't expect a ghost to drop from the ceiling. Elena didn't drop. She took the small encrypted thumb drive, the one she'd taken from the man on the highway, and a length of copper wire. She wrapped the wire around the drive, creating a makeshift induction coil. She looked at the power conduit running along the ceiling of the server room, just inches from her grate. It was a 480-volt line, shielded and heavy. She didn't need to plug the drive in. She just needed to get it close enough to the electromagnetic field of the power line to bleed the data into the system. It was a dark competence move, something she discovered during a training exercise at Fort Belvoir when she realized she could hear the data moving through unshielded cables. She lowered the drive on the wire, letting it dangle just above the conduit. She closed her eyes and felt the surge. The data on the drive, the proof of the Black Mountain facility, the logs of the broken men, the financial records of Ethelgard's shadow contracts began to vibrate into the building's nervous system. It wasn't a hack. It was an infection. The blue lights on the servers began to flicker. In the glass enclosure, the monitors flared to life, a cascade of red text scrolling across the screens. "What the hell?" one of the guards shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the fans. The alarms began to scream, a high-pitched, piercing B-flat that cut through the white noise like a knife. Elena saw the guards move toward the console, their faces illuminated by the red glare of the emergency lights. They were confused. They were looking for a physical intruder, a breach in the firewall. They weren't looking at the ceiling. But then the frequency changed. The building's fire suppression system, a pre-action sprinkler system, was controlled by the same network. The infection reached the control node. The overhead pipes began to groan. Elena knew she had seconds. She kicked the grate open and dropped 20 feet, her body coiling as she hit the floor, rolling into the shadow of a server rack. The pain in her ankles was a sharp, white flash, but she ignored it. She stayed low, her suppressed MCX at the high ready. "Intruder!" the second guard yelled, his light catching the movement. The world turned into a chaos of strobing red light and the deafening roar of the alarm. Elena didn't fire at the guards. She fired at the glass enclosure. The tempered glass shattered into a million diamonds, the sound lost in the alarm. The guards spun, their rifles up, but they were shooting at shadows. Elena moved like water, sliding between the racks, her mind mapping the room through the sound of their boots on the raised floor. Asterisk clack clack clack. Asterisk the guard on the left, heavy, aggressive, asterisk scuff scuff, asterisk the guard on the right, hesitant. Elena popped up from behind rack 402. She fired 2 rounds, not at the guards, but at the halon canisters mounted on the wall. The canisters exploded, releasing a thick white cloud of gas that instantly sucked the oxygen out of the lower half of the room. The guards began to cough, their movements becoming sluggish and frantic as their brains starved for air. They collapsed to their knees, their rifles clattering to the floor. Elena didn't stop. She reached the central console, her fingers flying over the keyboard. She wasn't trying to save herself. She was trying to finish the upload. The progress bar on the screen was at 88%. "Come on," she whispered, her own lungs beginning to burn from the halon. The building began to shake. Outside, the little bird had returned, its pilot realizing that the fire at the SUV was a diversion. The helicopter was hovering directly over the roof, the downdraft of its rotors vibrating the steel beams of the data center. Elena could hear the death rattle of the building. The structural frequency was climbing, the resonance of the helicopter matching the vibration of the overloaded server racks. The floor beneath her feet began to ripple. Asterisk 92%. Asterisk a door at the far end of the room burst open. 3 more guards in full tactical gear, wearing gas masks, entered the room. They didn't hesitate. They saw the woman at the console and opened fire. The sound was a hammer blow to the ears. Rounds punched through the server racks, sending sparks and bits of plastic flying into the air. Elena dove behind the console, the metal housing groaning as it took the hits. She felt a sharp, searing heat in her shoulder, a graze, but enough to make her arm go numb for a heartbeat. She didn't cry out. She didn't beg. She reached up and grabbed the edge of the console, pulling herself back to the keyboard. Asterisk 96%. Asterisk the lead guard was 10 feet away, his silhouette a dark, terrifying shape in the white fog of the halon. He leveled his rifle at her head. "Vance!" A voice boomed over the building's intercom. It wasn't a guard. It was the colonel. He was in the building. He was watching her. "Stop the upload, Elena. If you finish this, there is no hole deep enough to hide you." Elena looked into the barrel of the guard's rifle. She looked at the screen. Asterisk 99%. Asterisk, "Then I guess I won't need a hole, Colonel," she whispered. She hit the enter key. The screen turned white. The word asterisk complete asterisk flashed for a fraction of a second before the entire system short-circuited, a massive blue arc of electricity jumping from the console to the floor. The guard pulled the trigger, but the frequency of the building had reached its limit. At the exact moment the guard fired, the vibration from the helicopter above and the overloaded power grid below hit the harmonic peak. The massive cooling towers on the roof, already compromised by Elena's earlier sabotage, tore loose from their mounts. The ceiling didn't just collapse, it imploded. Thousands of gallons of water and tons of steel crashed through the roof, a localized tsunami that swept through the server room. The guard's shot went wide as the floor beneath him buckled. Elena was thrown backward by the force of the water, her body slamming into a server rack. The cold was a shock, a brutal physical weight that pinned her against the metal. The world went dark, filled with the roar of rushing water and the scream of twisting steel. For a moment, there was nothing but the specific moment of maximum pressure. The weight of the world, the failure of her body, the absolute certainty that this was the end. She could have let go. She could have let the water take her. It would have been a soldier's death, quiet, classified, and final. But then she felt a hand. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a memory. It was a solid, warm grip on her collar. "I've got you, Chief." Holloway, he hadn't gone to the marina. He hadn't left her. He was waist-deep in the churning water, his face a mask of determination and fear, his other hand gripped onto a structural pillar. He pulled her toward him, his muscles straining against the current. "The boat!" Elena gasped, her voice raw. "Kessler's got them there," Holloway shouted over the roar of the water. "I came back for my gear." He managed a grim, bloody smile as he hauled her onto a section of the raised floor that was still holding. They scrambled through the ruins of the server room, the water receding as it found the lower levels of the building. The alarms were dead. The lights were out. The only sound was the distant, fading whine of the little bird as it pulled away from the collapsing roof. They reached the loading dock, the air outside smelling of rain and the lake and the ozone of the destroyed data center. Elena stumbled out into the night, leaning heavily on Holloway. Her jumpsuit was in tatters, her shoulder was bleeding, and her bare feet were cut and bruised. She looked back at the building. The blue neon Ethelgard sign flickered once, twice, and then went dark. The silence that followed was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. It wasn't the silence of the mountain or the silence of the cell. It was the immediate aftermath, the surreal texture of a world that had been changed and didn't know it yet. A mile away, the first sirens began to wail. Not the sharp, aggressive chirps of the police, but the long, low-frequency moans of the fire trucks. "The marina," Elena said, her voice a whisper. They moved through the shadows of the warehouse district, two broken figures in a city that was about to wake up to a storm it couldn't see. Elena felt every step in her bones. The cost was settling in the physical damage, the institutional betrayal, the knowledge that by tomorrow morning her face would be on every news cycle as a fugitive. But as they reached the edge of the marina, she saw it. The boat with the blue hull. Sarah Jenkins was standing on the deck, her eyes wide as she saw them. Kessler was at the helm, his hands shaking but his gaze fixed on the open water. Holloway helped Elena onto the boat. She collapsed onto the starboard cushion, her hand automatically reaching for the space beneath it. The key was there. "Start the engine," Elena commanded. The inboard motor roared to life, a deep, rhythmic throb that felt like a pulse. As the boat pulled away from the dock, the lights of Coeur d'Alene began to recede. Elena looked at the survivors. They were huddled together, wrapped in blankets they'd found in the cabin. They weren't ghosts anymore. They were witnesses. She looked at Holloway. He was sitting on the gunwale, his eyes on the horizon, his hand resting on the grip of his pistol. He looked at her, and the loyalty between them was a tangible thing, a bridge built of fire and water. "You did it, Elena," he said quietly. "No," she said, looking down at her hands. "We just started the song." She reached into her pocket and pulled out her father's old stopwatch, the one she'd used to keep her sanity in the cell. She clicked the button. The timer began to run, the logs were out, the servers were dead. The message had been sent. But as she looked back at the city, she saw a line of black SUVs pulling onto the highway, their headlights a series of cold, predatory eyes. The reckoning was coming. The institution would not go quietly. The men who owned the mountain would not accept a woman who knew their frequency. Elena Vance closed her eyes and leaned her head against the vibrating hull of the boat. She felt the water rushing past, a 12 hertz hum that was steady and true. She was still standing. She was still breathing. And for the first time in her life, the world was finally listening to the sound of the wall breaking. The boat moved deeper into the darkness of the lake, leaving the burning valley and the broken city behind. Elena didn't look at the future. She didn't look at the past. She stayed in the moment, in the rhythm of the engine and the smell of the spray. She was a weapon that had been fired. She was a signal that had been sent. The cost had been paid, but the hope, small, quiet, and dangerous, was still alive in the dark. She felt the vibration of the boat change as they hit the deeper water. It was a new frequency, a new path, and Elena Vance, the woman who heard the world, finally allowed herself to breathe. Behind them, the first light of dawn began to touch the peaks of the Bitterroot Range, but the valley was still shrouded in smoke. The story of what happened at Black Mountain was no longer a secret. It was a frequency, and a frequency, once heard, can never be silenced. The antiseptic smell of the infirmary at Fairchild Air Force Base was a sharp, clinical blade that cut through the lingering scent of lake water and ozone still trapped in Elena Vance's hair. By the time the sun hit the whitewashed walls of her holding room on Saturday morning, 3 separate intelligence agencies would be arguing over who got to bury her first, and she would still be staring at the ceiling, counting the 60-cycle hum of the fluorescent ballast like it was the only heartbeat left in the world. Her right shoulder was a mapped territory of fire and gauze, the graze from the guard's rifle now a dull, rhythmic throb that pulsed in perfect sync with the cooling fans of the medical monitors. She didn't move when the heavy steel door at the end of the hall groaned on its hinges. She didn't move when the rhythmic, heavy tread of polished low quarters signaled the arrival of the first wave of men who would try to tell her what she had seen and why it didn't matter. She simply waited, her breath steady, her mind cataloging the vibration of the room. The 14 hertz rattle of the window pane, the 400 hertz whine of the secure terminal on the desk, and the frantic, jagged 120 hertz stutter of the man currently standing outside her door, trying to decide if he was there to arrest her or thank her. Major Thomas Miller of the Criminal Investigation Division did not look like a man who enjoyed his job. He sat across from Elena in a chair that was too small for his frame, his notebook open to a page that remained stubbornly blank. The air between them was thick with the smell of scorched electronics and the lukewarm, metallic scent of base exchange coffee. Miller had been in the room for 20 minutes, and so far, the only sound had been the scratch of his pen against his palm. He was looking at the file, the one that didn't officially exist, containing the records of a chief warrant officer who had been listed as KIA/body unrecovered 6 months ago in a training exercise that never happened. The official report from the Coeur d'Alene Fire Department says the Ethelgard Regional Data Center suffered a catastrophic cooling system failure. Miller said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated at a cautious 80 hertz. They're calling it an act of God, a freak harmonic resonance event triggered by a low-flying civilian aircraft. They haven't mentioned the gunfire. They haven't mentioned the 14 civilians we pulled out of a drainage ditch 3 miles away. And they certainly haven't mentioned you, Chief. Elena didn't look at him. She watched a single dust mote dance in the sliver of sunlight coming through the reinforced glass. The little bird wasn't civilian, she said, her voice like dry parchment. It was an unmasked asset, tail number obscured, specialized suppression kits on the turbines. You know that, Major. You saw the wreckage of the SUV. Miller shifted, the plastic of his chair protesting with a sharp, discordant squeak. I saw a pile of melted scrap metal that used to be a government-leased vehicle. I saw a dead data center. And I have a colonel from the Pentagon sitting in my CO's office right now telling me that if I so much as record your name in the blotter, I'll be spending the rest of my career counting snowshoes in Thule, Greenland. He leaned forward, his shadow falling across Elena's bed. But here's the thing, Vance. I'm 3 years from retirement. I've seen enough cover-ups to know when the rug is too small for the dirt. You uploaded something. The servers are fried, but the packets hit the outbound nodes before the collapse. Where did you send it? Elena finally turned her head. Her eyes were flat, the pupils dilated from the concussion she was still ignoring. She looked at Miller and saw the reckoning starting to take shape in the set of his jaw. He wasn't a villain. He was a cog that had suddenly felt the machine slip a gear. I didn't send it to the news, Major. I didn't send it to a foreign power. I sent it to the one place that can't ignore a breach of this magnitude because it threatens the only thing they care about more than their careers. And what's that? The integrity of the grid, Elena said. I sent the logs to the National Security Agency's internal audit frequency. Not a person, a machine. A watchdog program called Sentinel that monitors for anomalies in shadow contract billing and kinetic energy expenditures. By now, the algorithm has flagged 342 discrepancies in Ethelgard's Idaho operations. It's a self-executing audit. No one can stop it without triggering a Tier 1 security review, not even your colonel. The silence that followed was heavy, a physical weight that pressed into the room. Miller closed his notebook. He looked at her with a mixture of professional respect and genuine pity. You think that saves you? You've just made yourself a permanent liability to the most powerful people in the Department of Defense. They don't care about the truth, Vance. They care about the signal-to-noise ratio, and right now you're the loudest noise in the building. He stood up, the movement slow and weary. Captain Halloway is in Building 402. He's being processed for Article 32. They're going to pin the theft of the SUV and the destruction of the data center on him. They're saying he had a psychotic break. that he kidnapped those civilians and you were his victim. Elena's hand, the one not in the sling, curled into a fist. The frequency of the room suddenly felt sharp, like 1,000 tiny needles against her skin. Holloway saved their lives. He saved mine. Doesn't matter, Miller said, his voice softening as he reached the door. In the military's eyes, he's a manageable casualty. You, on the other hand, they don't know what to do with you yet, so they're going to keep you here in the dark while they decide if you're a hero or a ghost. He left, the heavy clack of the lock echoing through the infirmary. Elena lay back, her eyes closing. She could feel the personal cost arriving now, not as a sudden blow, but as a slow, freezing tide. Her career was over. Her name was a stain. Holloway, the man who had seen her clearly when the world went blind, was being sacrificed to protect a system that had already failed him. She felt a surge of rage, a cold, precise anger that vibrated at a frequency she had never felt before. It wasn't the rage of a victim. It was the rage of a weapon that was still loaded. 3 floors up, in a conference room that smelled of stale tobacco and high-stakes desperation, Colonel Sterling sat at the head of a mahogany table, staring at a printout that shouldn't have existed. Beside him, 2 men in expensive, ill-fitting suits from Ethelgard's legal team were talking in hushed, frantic tones about containment and mitigation. Sterling wasn't listening. He was looking at a photograph of the Black Mountain facility, now a smoking crater hidden under a controlled demolition order. He had spent 20 years building the shadow architecture of the Pacific Northwest. He had moved money through black holes in the budget that even the GAO couldn't find. He had convinced himself that the broken men in the mountain were a necessary sacrifice for a greater stability, a secret weapon that could disrupt enemy communications before a single shot was fired. And it had all been undone by a chief warrant officer with a preternatural ear for the sound of a lie. "We can't just make her disappear," one of the suits said, his voice thin and reedy. "The NSA ping is already being investigated by the Inspector General's office. If Vance goes missing now, it looks like a confession." Sterling finally looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, the skin beneath them sagging with the weight of a dozen sleepless hours. "You don't understand," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Vance isn't the problem. The problem is the echo. She didn't just upload the files. She embedded a harmonic key in the transmission. If the IG opens those files without the proper decryption frequency, which only she has, it triggers a secondary wipe of our entire regional server network. She's held the evidence hostage from inside a holding cell." The lawyers went silent. The room felt colder, the hum of the HVAC system suddenly sounding like a countdown. "She's smarter than we gave her credit for," Sterling continued, his fingers tracing the edge of the table. "She knew we'd try to scrub the NSA servers. She's not playing for a trial, she's playing for a stalemate. So what do we do?" Sterling stood and walked to the window, looking out over the flight line where a C-130 was warming up, its 4 engines creating a deep, bone-shaking roar. "We do what we always do when a weapon malfunctions. We recalibrate the environment. If we can't break her, we break the people she's trying to protect. Find me the corporal, the one who was with her on the mountain. What was his name? Kessler. He's in a safe house in Spokane," the lawyer said, "under federal protection." "Not for long," Sterling whispered. "Tell the marshals there's a discrepancy in his witness statement. We need him back on base for re-education, and bring me Holloway. I want to talk to the captain. I want to see if he's ready to be a hero for the last time." Back in the infirmary, the sun had moved, casting long, skeletal shadows across Elena's bed. The door opened again, but this time the footsteps were different. Light, hesitant, the sound of someone who was afraid of the silence. It was Sarah Jenkins. She was dressed in a borrowed, oversized sweatshirt and jeans, her face pale, her hands trembling as she clutched a plastic bag from the base commissary. Behind her stood a young MP who looked like he would rather be anywhere else on Earth. "They gave me 5 minutes," Sarah whispered, moving to the side of the bed. She looked at Elena's bandaged shoulder, her eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall. "I brought you some things, toothbrush, some magazines, a candy bar. They wouldn't let me bring anything else." Elena sat up, the pain in her shoulder a sharp reminder of the night before. She looked at Sarah, really looked at her. This woman had spent 6 months in a dark room, her identity stripped away, her future stolen, and yet she was here. She was the hope that had survived the collapse. "How are the others?" Elena asked, her voice stronger than it had been an hour ago. "Scared," Sarah said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "They're being kept in a transit lounge at the terminal. They told us we're being reintegrated into society, but it feels more like being processed. Kessler is. He's not good, Elena. He's talking to the air. He thinks they're still listening. They are, Elena said softly. She reached out and took Sarah's hand. The skin was cold, but the pulse was steady. Listen to me, Sarah. You need to be strong for a little while longer. They're going to tell you that I'm a criminal. They're going to tell you that what happened on the mountain was a gas leak or a mass hallucination. They might even offer you money to sign a non-disclosure agreement. I won't sign anything, Sarah said, her voice hardening. I remember the sound of the door closing, Elena. I remember the way the air felt when you opened it. They can't take that away from me. Elena felt a lump in her throat, a rare, uncomfortable sensation. This was the loyalty that didn't have a rank or a branch. It was the bond of the witness. When they move you, look for the man I told you about, Miller. He's a major. He's the only one who might be able to get you out of here without a tail. If you see him, tell him the frequency is 14, just that. He'll know what it means. Frequency is 14, Sarah repeated, her eyes searching Elena's. What does it mean? It means the bridge is still standing, Elena said. The MP cleared his throat, tapping his watch. Sarah stood up, squeezing Elena's hand one last time before being led away. As she reached the door, she turned back. Kessler said something before they took him. He said you were the only one who could hear the mountain screaming. I didn't know what he meant until I saw you standing in that server room. You didn't look like a soldier. You looked like the wind. She was gone and the room was silent again. Elena lay back, her mind racing. Asterisk, the frequency is 14. Asterisk, it was the resonant frequency of the bridge they had used to escape, but it was also the frequency of the dead man's switch she had embedded in the NSA upload. If Miller was as smart as she hoped he would realize that 14 was the key to the second half of the data, the part that named names. But as the afternoon faded into evening, the institutional response began to shift from observation to active suppression. The lights in the hallway dimmed, and the 60-cycle hum of the building changed. It became deeper, a more aggressive thrum that Elena recognized instantly. It was the sound of a white noise generator being activated in the ventilation system. They were isolating her. They were cutting off her sensory connection to the rest of the base. She stood up, her legs shaky but holding. She walked to the window and looked out. The base was in a state of high-intensity activity. Humvees were patrolling the perimeter of the infirmary. 2 Black Hawk helicopters were idling on the pad, their rotors creating a wall of sound that was designed to drown out anything else. She wasn't being treated anymore. She was being besieged. The door opened for the 3rd time that day, but this time there was no Major Miller. There was no Sarah. 2 men in charcoal gray tactical gear, wearing earpieces and carrying suppressed sidearms, entered the room. They didn't say a word. They didn't look her in the eye. One of them held out a set of heavy, high-security shackles. Chief Warrant Officer Elena Vance, the other one said, his voice a flat, synthesized drone. You are being transferred to a secure facility at Fort Leavenworth pending a general court-martial. You are being charged with treason, destruction of government property, and the unauthorized release of classified data. Elena didn't resist. She held out her wrists, the cold steel of the cuffs snapping shut with a finality that felt like a tombstone. She didn't beg for her rights. She didn't ask for a lawyer. She knew the machinery was now in full motion, designed to protect the institution at any cost. As they led her down the hallway, she passed the open door of a small office. Inside, she saw a television screen. The news was on. An anchor was talking about a tragic industrial accident in Idaho. They showed a picture of the Ethelgard building, now a pile of rubble. They showed a photo of a generic rogue soldier whose face was blurred but whose rank was clearly visible. The narrative was being set. The reckoning was being buried under a layer of carefully crafted lies. They took her out a side exit, avoiding the main infirmary entrance. A black Suburban was waiting, its engine idling with a 150 Hz vibration that made Elena's teeth ache. As they pushed her into the back seat, she saw a figure standing in the shadows of the loading dock. It was Holloway. He was in dress blues, but they were rumpled, his tie undone, his eyes hollowed out by a fatigue that went deeper than bone. He was handcuffed to a thick-necked MP, but for a split second he looked up and caught Elena's gaze. There was no speech. There were no words of comfort. But in that one shared moment, Elena saw the cost of their victory. Holloway had been broken by the same system he had spent his life defending. He was being sent to a different cage, a different silence. But he didn't look away. He nodded, a short, sharp movement of his head, and Elena knew that even if they never spoke again, they had both stayed true to the mission. The Suburban pulled away, the tires crunching on the gravel. Elena looked out the window as the base faded into the distance. She saw the mountains on the horizon, the dark, jagged peaks of the Bitterroots where it had all started. She was a prisoner. She was a traitor. She was a ghost. But as the vehicle hit the highway, Elena closed her eyes and focused on the vibration of the road. She could feel the 14 hertz hum of the bridges they crossed. She could feel the 60-cycle pulse of the power lines. And somewhere, buried deep in the static of the world, she could still hear the song of the data she had released. It was moving. It was growing. It was a frequency that couldn't be unheard. The institution was grinding her down, but they were doing it on a foundation that was already cracked. They thought they were taking her to a cell. They didn't realize they were taking the weapon into the heart of the fortress. The car drove through the night, the silence inside the cabin becoming a physical presence. The two guards didn't speak. They didn't even breathe loudly. They were dark competence personified, men who followed orders without question, who existed in the spaces between the rules. Hours passed. The Idaho landscape gave way to the rolling hills of the Palouse, then the flat, endless expanses of the interior. Elena didn't sleep. She stayed in the controlled state, her mind a calm, quiet room in the middle of a storm. Suddenly, the Suburban began to slow down. Elena opened her eyes. They weren't at an airport. They weren't at a military base. They were on a lonely stretch of two-lane highway, surrounded by fields of wheat that swayed in the wind like a golden sea. A second vehicle was parked on the shoulder, a nondescript white van with government plates. Out, the guard on her right said. They pulled her from the car. The air was cold, the smell of damp earth and ripening grain filling her lungs. She looked around, her eyes searching the horizon. There was nothing for miles. The door of the white van opened. A man stepped out. He wasn't in uniform. He was wearing a charcoal suit and a long wool coat, his hair silver at the temples, his face a map of decades spent in the gray space of Washington, D.C. He walked toward Elena with a slow, deliberate gait, his hands in his pockets. It was General Marcus Thorne, the man who had authorized the Black Mountain Project 3 years ago, and the man whose name was at the very top of the list Elena had uploaded to the NSA. "You've caused a lot of trouble, Chief," Thorne said, his voice a smooth, cultured tenor that sounded like velvet over glass. He stopped 5 feet from her, his eyes scanning her face with a terrifyingly neutral curiosity. "I've spent the last 6 hours explaining to the Secretary of Defense why a warrant officer with a history of psychological instability was able to nearly bankrupt a multi-billion-dollar defense contractor." Elena stood her ground, the wind whipping her hair across her face. "I think the psychological instability started when your people began using American soldiers as sensory experiments, General. I'm just the aftershock." Thorne smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "The mountain was a failure of execution, not a failure of intent. We are in a new kind of war, Vance, a war of frequencies, a war where the person who can hear the most wins the most. You were the most successful asset we ever produced. You just didn't want to be an asset." "I'm a soldier," Elena said, her voice dropping an octave. "Soldiers serve people, not frequencies, not contracts." "A noble sentiment," Thorne said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small encrypted tablet. He turned the screen toward her. "But let's talk about reality. The NSA audit has been paused by a direct order from the White House. National security concerns. The files you uploaded are being moved to a vault in Virginia where they will remain unprocessed for the next 50 years. He stepped closer, his scent, a mix of expensive sandalwood and old paper, filling her space. "You're not going to Leavenworth, Elena. You're too dangerous for a prison. If you're in a cell, you're a martyr. If you're a martyr, the song continues. No, we're going to do something much more effective." He tapped the screen. A map appeared. It was a remote location in the Aleutian Islands, a place called Shemya, an old Cold War listening post, thousands of miles from civilization, surrounded by the most violent weather on the planet. "There's a station there," Thorne said. "Cobra Dane. It's a phased array radar system. It produces a massive, constant electromagnetic field, a frequency so loud and so pervasive that it drowns out everything else. You'll be the station's technical advisor. You'll live there, you'll work there, and you'll listen to the radar until your mind finally forgets how to hear anything else." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. He wasn't just silencing her. He was going to drown her in noise. He was going to use her extraordinary capability as a torture device, forcing her to live inside a shout that would eventually tear her mind apart. "The choice is yours," Thorne said. "You can go to Shemya and live out your days in the noise, or you can give me the decryption key. You can tell me how to kill the dead man's switch. If you do that, I'll see that Holloway is reinstated. I'll see that Sarah Jenkins and the others get a quiet, comfortable life with all the medical care they need. And you can walk away, a new name, a new life, anywhere but here." The cost was laid out on the table, clear and brutal. Her own sanity versus the lives of the people who had believed in her. The loyalty she had fought so hard for was being used as the lever to break her. Elena looked at the general. She looked at the two guards. She looked at the vast, empty fields of her country. She could feel the controlled rage deep in her chest, but she didn't let it show. She stayed perfectly still, listening to the world one last time. She heard the 14 hertz hum of the wind through the wheat. She heard the 400 hertz whine of the general's tablet. And then she heard something else. A distant, low-frequency rumble. Not a car, not a plane. It was a train. A mile to the east, a heavy freight train was moving across the landscape. Its vibration was traveling through the earth, a deep, rhythmic thud that Elena could feel in the soles of her feet. It was a 10 hertz pulse, steady and relentless. Elena looked back at Thorne. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of her mouth. "The frequency isn't 14, General," she whispered. Thorne frowned, leaning in. "What?" "I said you're looking at the wrong bridge." At that exact moment, the ground beneath them began to vibrate with an intensity that made the Suburban's windows rattle. It wasn't just the train. Elena had realized something the moment she saw the general's tablet. The Sentinel program she had triggered wasn't just an audit. It was a logic bomb designed to search for the specific EM signatures of the Ethelgard project. And Thorne was standing right in front of her, holding an active high-frequency transmitter that was broadcasting his own signature. A mile away at a regional substation, a series of circuit breakers began to pop. The local grid, overloaded by the sudden request from the Sentinel audit, began to surge. The power lines overhead began to hum, a high-pitched, terrifying scream that climbed from 60 hertz to 120 to 240 to 500. "What's happening?" Thorne shouted, his poise finally cracking as the tablet in his hand began to smoke. The transformer on the nearby pole exploded in a shower of blue sparks and white-hot oil. The world went dark for a split second before the emergency lights on the Suburban kicked in. Elena didn't wait. She used the shock of the explosion to drop her weight, her shackled hands swinging in a short, brutal arc that caught the nearest guard under the chin. He went down like a stone. She didn't run. She didn't have anywhere to go. She simply stood there in the middle of the road, the dark competence of her training taking over as the world dissolved into chaos. The second guard reached for his weapon, but the general was screaming, his hand scorched by the melting tablet. "Kill the signal! Kill the signal!" But there was no signal to kill. The song was no longer in the servers. It was in the air. It was in the soil. It was in the very electricity that powered the world they were trying to control. The freight train roared past in the distance, its whistle a long, mournful B-flat that felt like a funeral dirge for the men who owned the mountain. Elena Vance stood in the center of the road, her head held high, the wind whipping her hair like a flag. She was still in chains. She was still a fugitive. But as she looked at the terrified men around her, she realized that the cost had been worth it. She hadn't just exposed a secret. She had changed the frequency of the entire world. The general looked at her, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You think this is over, Vance? You think you've won? We will find you. We will erase you. We will make sure your name is never spoken again." Elena looked at him, her eyes bright with a cold, terrifying clarity. "You can erase my name, General. You can bury the files. You can even send me to the noise." She stepped forward, her shackles clinking in the dark. "But you can't stop the hum, and every time you hear a phone ring or a car start or a bridge groan in the wind, you're going to remember my voice. You're going to remember that a woman you thought was nothing was the one who finally found your frequency." Thorne backed away, his face pale, his hands shaking. He looked at his guards, but they were staring at the burning transformer, their dark competence shattered by a force they didn't understand. They pushed her back into the van, the doors slamming shut with a sound like a gunshot. The vehicle sped away into the night, heading toward the coast, toward the noise, toward a future that was still unwritten. But as Elena Vance sat in the dark, her body bruised and her heart heavy, she felt a single, steady vibration in her palm. It was her father's stopwatch. It was still running. She hadn't lost. She had just finished part 1. The boat with the blue hull was still out there. Sarah was still breathing. Holloway was still fighting. And somewhere, in a basement in D.C., an auditor was looking at a screen that was glowing with a 14 hertz pulse that wouldn't go away. Elena closed her eyes and leaned her head against the wall of the van. The hope was there, small and dangerous like a spark in a dry forest. She was going to the Aleutians. She was going to the noise. But she wasn't going alone. She was taking the truth with her, and the truth, once it has a frequency, can never be silenced. The van reached the coast as the first light of dawn touched the Pacific. A massive gray transport plane was waiting on the tarmac, its engines already spinning, creating a wall of sound that felt like the end of the world. Elena was led up the ramp, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She didn't look back at the general. She didn't look back at the life she was leaving behind. She walked into the belly of the plane, her steps steady, her mind clear. As the ramp closed and the plane began to taxi, the noise of the engines rose to a deafening roar, a 2,000-hertz scream that filled every corner of the cabin. The guards put on their noise-canceling headphones. They looked at Elena, expecting her to flinch, to scream, to break under the pressure of the sound. But Elena Vance just sat there, her eyes closed, a faint smile on her lips. She wasn't hearing the engines. She was hearing the 14-hertz hum of a bridge 3,000 miles away. She was hearing the heartbeat of a world that was finally, after so much silence, starting to wake up. And as the plane took off, climbing into the gray Alaskan sky, Elena Vance finally allowed herself to believe that the reckoning was only just beginning. The resolution was coming. The final landing was in sight. But for now, there was only the flight, the noise, and the knowledge that she was the only one who knew the code to turn it off. The story was not over. The weight had not been lifted. The real battle was about to begin, and Elena Vance was the only one who knew the frequency of the end. The C-130 Hercules touched down on the rusted, salt-pitted runway of Shemya Island with a violence that vibrated through Elena Vance's marrow at a bone-shaking 12 hertz. It was a landing designed to remind the cargo that they were no longer in the world of soft landings and civilian oversight. As the rear ramp groaned open, the pressurized cabin air was instantly devoured by the subarctic gale of the Aleutians, a wind that carried the scent of frozen kelp, JP-8 fuel, and the metallic, electric tang of the most powerful radar on the planet. Elena didn't wait for the guards to prompt her. She stood, her wrists still locked in the heavy high-security cuffs, and walked toward the blinding, flat gray light of the edge of the world. The island was a jagged shard of volcanic rock and reinforced concrete, barely 4 miles long and 2 miles wide, hammered by the relentless gray fist of the North Pacific. Dominating the skyline like a prehistoric monolith was the Cobra Dane radar, a 6-story, phased array face of hexagonal geometry that stared eternally toward the Bering Sea. It didn't just look at the horizon, it felt it. Even from the tarmac, Elena could feel the massive, invisible pulse of the L-band frequency. It was a rhythmic, pulsing roar in the center of her skull, a 1,200 megahertz shout that drowned out the wind, the engines, and the very concept of silence. This was her prison. It wasn't a cell with bars. It was a cell made of sound. 2 men in heavy Gore-Tex parkas, their faces obscured by polarized goggles and wind masks, took her by the elbows. They didn't speak. On Shemya, conversation was a luxury the noise usually killed before the words could travel a yard. They led her toward a squat, windowless bunker of corrugated steel and poured concrete that sat in the long, electromagnetic shadow of the radar face. The ground beneath her boots was a constant, low-frequency hum, the vibration of the massive cooling pumps that kept the radar from melting its own internal architecture. They brought her into a small, sterile room that smelled of ozone and industrial floor wax. The walls were lined with acoustic foam, the jagged black pyramids designed to swallow sound, but against the sheer power of Cobra Dane, they were as useless as paper. The guards removed her shackles. One of them pointed to a metal bunk bolted to the floor and a desk equipped with a high-definition monitor and a specialized audio interface. Chief Warrant Officer Vance, a voice crackled through a wall-mounted speaker, distorted by the EM interference. "Welcome to Station Erickson. You are here because you possess a unique aptitude for signal analysis. You will be tasked with monitoring the deep space debris tracks. Your shift is 12 hours on, 12 hours off. You will not leave this wing. You will not attempt to access external communications. If you perform your duties, you will be fed. If you do not, the frequency in this room will be shifted to a range that makes sleep impossible. Do you understand?" Elena looked at the camera lens embedded in the acoustic foam. She didn't answer. She sat on the bunk and closed her eyes. She didn't listen to the speaker. She listened to the room. The room was screaming. The 60-cycle hum of the fluorescent lights was fighting with the 400-cycle whine of the ventilation system, and both were being crushed by the percussive 2 gigahertz hammer of the radar. To a normal person, it was just a dull, annoying buzz. To Elena, it was a physical assault. It was 1,000 needles pressing against her eardrums. She felt the controlled rage return, but she pushed it down, turning it into the same cold, precise discipline she had used on the mountain. They thought they were drowning her. They thought that by putting her in the heart of the noise, they could break her ability to distinguish the truth from the static. They didn't realize that Elena Vance had spent her whole life learning how to map the silence inside the storm. She walked to the desk. The monitor was alive with cascading green waterfalls of data, orbital tracks, satellite signatures, the chaotic debris of 50 years of space exploration. She put on the heavy, noise-canceling headphones provided. They didn't stop the radar. Nothing could stop the radar, but they gave her a baseline. She began to work. For the first 3 weeks, the world outside Shemia ceased to exist. There was only the green light, the smell of recycled air, and the constant, rhythmic thrum of the island. She tracked dead Soviet boosters. She cataloged the decay of spent-weather satellites. She performed her duties with a dark competence that must have frustrated the men watching her on the monitors. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't beg for the volume to be turned down. She ate the lukewarm trays of processed food pushed through the slot in her door. She slept in 4-hour increments, her mind training itself to use the radar's pulse as a metronome for her own breathing. But while she worked the official data, she was doing something else. Elena had realized on the 3rd day that the audio interface at her desk wasn't just for satellite tracking. It was a direct bypass into the station's internal diagnostic loop. Every time the radar pulsed, it sent a return signal through the entire facility, a harmonic echo that mapped the electrical state of every wire, every sensor, and every terminal on the island. She began to memorize the echo. She spent her off hours sitting in the dark, her back against the acoustic foam, feeling the vibrations through the wall. She was mapping the frequency of the fortress. She learned the specific resonance of the secure server room 3 floors down. She learned the 12-hertz stutter of the encrypted uplink that sent the radar data back to the Pentagon. And she learned the 14-hertz ghost signal that shouldn't have been there, the same frequency she had embedded in the NSA upload. It was still there. The Sentinel audit wasn't dead. It was a virus in the system, and even out here in the most isolated listening post in the world, the machine was still searching for the truth she had planted. On the 24th day, the door to her room opened. It wasn't the guards with a food tray. It was a man in a navy blue windbreaker with "Dadig" embroidered on the chest. He was thin with the sallow skin of someone who spent his life under LED lights and a pair of wire-rimmed glasses that were currently fogged from the transition into the heated room. He looked at Elena with a mixture of fear and professional curiosity. "Chief Vance," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm Special Agent Miller's replacement. My name is Aris. I've been sent by the Inspector General's office." Elena didn't stand up. She stayed on the bunk, her eyes flat and unreadable. "Miller is gone. Reassigned. Permanent medical leave," Aris said, stepping into the room and closing the door. He looked around nervously, his eyes lingering on the camera. "I have 5 minutes before the loop resets. They think I'm here to perform a technical audit on your terminal." "Are you?" "I'm here because the 14-hertz ping didn't stop," Aris said, leaning in. "You didn't just upload data, Vance. You turned the NSA's internal security protocol into a search and destroy algorithm. It's been 3 weeks, and the Ethelgard contracts are being frozen across the entire Pacific Northwest. They can't stop the audit without shutting down the entire Sentinel network, and the White House won't let them do that. It would leave the national grid blind." Elena felt a spark of hope, but it was a cold, dangerous thing. "What about Holloway? What about the others?" "Holloway is at JBLM, Fort Lewis," Aris whispered. "They're holding him in a psychiatric ward. They're trying to say he's a victim of EM-induced psychosis from the Idaho event, but the civilian survivors, Sarah Jenkins and the others, they haven't signed the NDAs. They're talking to the press, not the big networks. They've been gagged, but the local papers. The noise is getting out, Vance." Elena stood up then, the movement slow and deliberate. She walked to the desk and tapped the monitor. "They brought me here to drown me, Aris, but the radar isn't just noise, it's a carrier wave. If you can get me into the primary diagnostic node for 10 minutes, I can use the Cobra Dane pulse to broadcast the decryption key. Not to the NSA, to every cell tower in the Aleutian chain. I can turn this island into a lighthouse." Aris turned pale. "That's treason. They'll kill you before you finish the upload." "They're already killing me," Elena said, her voice a low, vibrating hum that seemed to sync with the room. "The cost has already been paid. I'm just trying to make sure the receipt gets filed." Aris looked at her, and for a moment he saw the extraordinary capability that Colonel Sterling had been so afraid of. He didn't see a broken prisoner. He saw a woman who had become part of the machine she was trying to dismantle. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted thumb drive. "I can't get you to the node," he said, his voice trembling. "But I can give you this. It's the bypass code for the station's emergency broadcast system. It was meant for a nuclear event. If you can trigger it, the radar will automatically sync to the civilian emergency frequencies. You have to be fast. Once the bypass is active, the station's security will have a hard lock on your location in 60 seconds. Elena took the drive. The metal was cold in her hand. "Why are you helping me?" Aris looked at the door, his hand on the handle. "Because I saw the photos from the mountain, Vance. I saw what they did to those men. My brother was a contractor for Ethelgard. He died in a training accident 2 years ago. No body, no explanation, just a flag and a closed casket." He looked back at her, his eyes wet. "Make them hear it. Make them hear all of it." He left and the door clicked shut. Elena didn't move for a long time. She sat at the desk, the thumb drive resting on the keyboard. She could feel the tension of the clock starting to tick, not a physical clock, but the internal one she had developed over a decade of service. She knew the rhythm of the guards' patrols. She knew the cycle of the radar's cooling fans. She had 20 minutes before the next shift change. She didn't hesitate. She plugged the drive into the terminal. The screen flickered. The green waterfalls of satellite data vanished, replaced by a stark red command prompt. Asterisk system override detected. Enter authentication code. Asterisk Elena's fingers flew across the keys, her mind moving at the speed of the frequencies she lived in. She didn't think about the consequences. She didn't think about the cost to her career or her life. She thought about Holloway in a white room at Fort Lewis. She thought about Sarah Jenkins' trembling hands. She thought about the broken men in the mountain who would never have a voice again. The room began to vibrate. The 1200 megahertz pulse of the radar shifted. The sound changed from a dull thrum to a sharp, high-pitched whine that made the glass of the monitor crack. Asterisk bypass active. Broadcasting on all frequencies. Asterisk Elena didn't upload a document. She didn't upload a video, she uploaded a sound. It was the recording she had made in the server room in Idaho, the sound of the mountain screaming. But she had layered it with the harmonic key, the mathematical proof of the frequency experiments. It wasn't something people would hear with their ears. It was something they would feel in their teeth. It was a signal that would override every radio, every television, and every cell phone from Shemia to Anchorage. The alarm in the hallway began to wail, a jagged 110 decibel 800 hertz stutter that signaled a Tier 1 security breach. Elena didn't move. She watched the progress bar on the monitor. 40%, 60%, 80%. The door was kicked open. 4 men in tactical gear, their rifles raised, stormed into the room. They didn't shout. They didn't tell her to put her hands up. The lead guard fired a non-lethal taser, the twin probes striking Elena in the shoulder, sending 50,000 volts of electricity through her nervous system. She collapsed, her body seizing, her mind exploding into a whiteout of pure, agonizing noise. But as she hit the floor, her hand caught the edge of the desk and her finger pressed the final key. Asterisk upload complete. Asterisk the world went black. When Elena Vance woke up, the noise was gone. It wasn't the silence of a quiet room. It was the absolute, crushing silence of a total hearing loss. She opened her eyes and saw a white ceiling. She felt the softness of a bed beneath her. She felt the weight of a heavy blanket. She tried to speak, but she couldn't hear her own voice. She felt the vibration in her throat, the familiar 100 hertz resonance of her vocal cords, but the world was a mute film. A doctor in a white coat was standing over her, his mouth moving, his expression one of clinical concern. He held up a clipboard with a handwritten note. Asterisk, you are at Elmendorf Air Force Base, Anchorage. You have suffered a catastrophic cochlear rupture due to acoustic trauma. We are monitoring for permanent damage. Asterisk, Elena looked at the note, then at the doctor. She felt a strange sense of peace. The cost had finally been collected. The noise that had defined her life, the gift that had been her curse, had been taken away. She was no longer a censor. She was just a woman. She reached out and took the pen from the doctor's pocket. She wrote on the bottom of the clipboard. Asterisk, did they hear IT? Asterisk, the doctor hesitated, looking toward the door. He leaned in, his face close to hers, and for a split second the clinical mask slipped. He nodded, a short, sharp movement. He took the pen and wrote one word, asterisk everyone. Asterisk the reckoning took 3 months to unfold. Because the signal had been broadcast through the Cobra Dane radar, it had been captured by every monitoring station in the Pacific Rim. It had been recorded by the Japanese, the Russians, and the Canadians. It was a signal that couldn't be contained or mitigated. The harmonic signature was a fingerprint that pointed directly back to the Ethelgard Corporation and the shadow funding of the Department of Defense. The hearings were held in a closed session of the Senate Intelligence Committee, but the leaks were a steady, unstoppable drip. Colonel Sterling was forced into early retirement before being quietly indicted for conspiracy to defraud the government. General Thorne disappeared from public life, his name scrubbed from the rolls of the active duty command, though the institutional response ensured he never saw the inside of a courtroom. Ethelgard declared bankruptcy 6 weeks after the Shemya broadcast. The Black Mountain facility was permanently decommissioned. The broken men transferred to private VA facilities where their families were finally allowed to see them. Elena Vance did not attend the hearings. She did not receive a medal. She did not get a public vindication. She was processed for an administrative discharge under medical/other than honorable conditions. The official reason was psychological instability leading to the unauthorized discharge of a classified signal. They couldn't court-martial her, not without making her a witness, so they simply erased her. On a cold Tuesday in November, Elena walked out of the side gate of Elmendorf Air Force Base. She was wearing a civilian coat she had bought at the commissary and carrying a single duffel bag. She had a hearing aid in her left ear, a small, high-tech device that allowed her to hear the world in a tinny, compressed range of frequencies. It wasn't the same. The world sounded like it was being played through a broken radio. The rich, deep math of the universe was gone, replaced by a flat, gray static. She stood on the sidewalk, the Alaskan wind biting at her face. She didn't have a plan. She didn't have a home to go back to. A black SUV pulled up to the curb. Elena didn't flinch. She watched the driver's side door open. It was Holloway. He looked different. He was thinner, his hair shot through with new streaks of gray, and he was wearing a simple flannel shirt and jeans. He walked around the car and stood in front of her. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at her, his eyes searching her face with the same loyalty that had seen her through the mountain. He tapped his own ear, then pointed to hers. He held up a piece of paper. Asterisk, I heard the lighthouse, Elena. Asterisk, Elena felt a lump in her throat, a physical pressure she couldn't suppress. She reached out and touched his arm, the fabric of his sleeve rough under her hand. She could feel the vibration of his breathing, the steady 12 hertz rhythm of a man who had finally found his way home. He opened the passenger door for her. Elena got in, the smell of the interior, old coffee, dog hair, and pine-scented air freshener, feeling like the most American thing she had ever encountered. "Where are we going?" she asked. She couldn't hear her own voice clearly, but she saw him smile. He didn't write an answer. He just started the car and pulled away from the base, heading south toward the highway that would eventually lead them back to the lower 48. They drove for hours in a silence that was finally, for the first time in Elena's life, a choice. They crossed the border into Canada, then down through the long, winding roads of the Yukon. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The shared moments of the mountain and the island were a language all their own. They reached a small town in the foothills of the Cascades in Washington 3 weeks later. It was a place called Cle Elum, a town of timber and trout streams, tucked into a valley where the air smelled of cedar and the sky was a deep, bruised purple. Holloway had a small cabin there, a place he had bought with his savings before everything went wrong. It was old, with a wide porch and a stone fireplace, sitting on the edge of a river that ran cold and fast over the rocks. "Is this it?" Elena asked as they stood on the porch, looking out at the water. Holloway nodded. He took her hand, his grip firm and warm. He looked at her, and for the first time, Elena saw the hope in his eyes. Not the desperate hope of a soldier in a foxhole, but the quiet, enduring hope of a person who had survived the end of the world and found something worth keeping. The first month in Cle Elum was a slow, rhythmic process of recalibration. Elena spent her days walking by the river, her hand trailing in the cold water. She learned to live with the hearing aid, to accept the limited, distorted version of the world it gave her. She learned to cook on an old cast-iron stove. She learned the specific frequency of the wind through the hemlocks and the 20 hertz thud of Holloway chopping wood behind the cabin. She wasn't a soldier anymore. She wasn't a weapon. She was just Elena, but the cost was always there. Some nights she would wake up in a cold sweat, her mind searching for the one. 2 gigahertz pulse of the radar, the silence of the cabin feeling like a physical weight on her chest. She would sit by the window and watch the stars, her hand clutching her father's stopwatch, the ticking the only thing that felt real. Holloway would always be there. He wouldn't ask what was wrong. He would just sit with her in the dark, his presence a controlled anchor that kept her from drifting back into the noise. One afternoon in late December, a man in a nondescript brown sedan drove up the long gravel driveway. Elena was on the porch, a cup of tea in her hands. She saw him coming and felt the old tension return, her muscles coiling with the dark competence that she couldn't quite leave behind. The man got out of the car. He was older, wearing a thick wool coat and a flat cap. He looked like a retired schoolteacher, but the way he scanned the perimeter of the cabin told Elena he was something else. He walked up to the porch and stopped at the bottom of the steps. He looked at Elena, his expression neutral. "Chief Vance," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that Elena's hearing aids struggled to process. "I don't go by that anymore," Elena said, her voice steady. "I know," the man said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, white envelope. He didn't step onto the porch, he just held it out. "I was told to deliver this to you personally. No names, no records." Elena took the envelope. It was heavy, the paper thick and expensive. She opened it. Inside was a single photograph and a small silver pin. The photograph was of Sarah Jenkins. She was standing in front of a small library, a stack of books in her arms, a genuine, radiant smile on her face. She looked healthy. She looked free. On the back, in a cramped, shaky hand, were 3 words, "Asterisk, we heard you." Asterisk, the pin was a warrant officer's bar, but it wasn't the standard issue. It was engraved with a small, stylized lighthouse. "Who sent this?" Elena asked, looking up. But the man was already back in his car. He didn't look back as he drove away, the dust from the driveway settling in the cold air. Elena stood on the porch for a long time, holding the pin in her hand. She felt the loyalty of the survivors, the quiet, invisible bond that the institution couldn't touch. She realized then that she didn't need a medal from the Pentagon. She didn't need her name on a plaque. The victory was in the photo. The victory was in the fact that Sarah Jenkins was smiling. She went back inside the cabin. Holloway was in the kitchen, the smell of roasting chicken and rosemary filling the air. He looked at her, saw the envelope, and raised an eyebrow. Elena didn't show him the pin. She put it in the small wooden box on the mantel next to her father's stopwatch. She showed him the photo of Sarah. Holloway looked at it, a slow smile spreading across his face. He nodded, then went back to the stove. That night, the first snow of the season began to fall. It was a soft, silent descent, the white flakes drifting through the air like the static on a dead channel. Elena sat in the armchair by the fire, a book in her lap. She had turned off her hearing aid, opting for the absolute peaceful silence of her own mind. She watched the flames dancing in the hearth, the orange light casting long, flickering shadows across the room. She felt a strange, new sensation. It wasn't a frequency. It wasn't a vibration. It was peace. She looked at Holloway, who was asleep on the sofa, his chest rising and falling in a steady, rhythmic cadence. She looked at the cabin, the sturdy, honest walls that held out the cold and the dark. She realized that she had finally found the one thing she had been searching for her entire life. She had found the silence that didn't need to be solved. She reached over and picked up her father's stopwatch. She looked at the face, the gold tarnished, the crystal scratched. She pressed the button, asterisk click. Asterisk, the ticking stopped. She set the watch down on the side table. She didn't need it to keep time anymore. She didn't need to count the seconds or map the pulses. She was no longer waiting for the next crisis. She was just here. The institutional cost had been her hearing, her career, and her name. But the human gain was the woman she saw in the mirror, a woman who was no longer defined by what she could do for the machine, but by what she had done for the people. She was Elena Vance. She was a daughter, a soldier, a ghost, and a friend. And as the snow covered the mountains, burying the world in a blanket of white, Elena finally closed her eyes and let herself sleep. She didn't dream of the mountain. She didn't dream of the radar. She dreamed of a blue-hulled boat on a calm lake, the water perfectly still, the only sound the soft, gentle lap of a world that was finally at rest. The morning came with a brilliance that only a fresh snow can bring. The world was a blinding, pristine white, the sky a pale, crystalline blue. Elena woke up and felt the cold air on her face. She reached for her hearing aid, but then she stopped. She didn't put it in. She walked to the window and looked out at the valley. She saw a pair of elk moving through the trees, their breath blooming in the air like small white clouds. She saw the river, partially frozen now, the water a dark, moving ribbon against the snow. She couldn't hear the elk. She couldn't hear the river, but as she stood there, she felt a familiar, low-frequency pulse in her chest. It wasn't the radar. It wasn't the grid. It was the heartbeat of the land. She realized that the extraordinary capability hadn't been destroyed by the noise of Shemia. It had been refined. She no longer needed her ears to hear the truth. She could feel it in the air, in the earth, in the very structure of the world. The machine had tried to drown her, but all they had done was strip away the noise so she could finally hear the signal that mattered. She was a witness. She was a guardian. And as long as she was alive, the truth would always have a frequency. Holloway came into the room, his hair mussed from sleep. He saw her standing by the window and walked over, wrapping his arms around her from behind. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his warmth a solid, comforting presence against the morning chill. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Elena leaned back against him, closing her eyes. She felt the loyalty that had survived the collapse, the hope that had weathered the storm. She felt the cost of the journey, but for the first time, the weight didn't feel heavy. It felt like an anchor, keeping her grounded in the life she had earned. They stayed like that for a long time, two people standing in the silence at the edge of the world, watching the sun climb over the peaks. The world outside Clee Alum was still loud. The institutions were still grinding. The men in the charcoal suits were still making their plans. But in this one specific room, in this one specific moment, the noise couldn't reach them. Elena Vance was 32 years old, and for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She walked out onto the porch later that morning, her boots crunching in the fresh powder. The air was so cold it stung her lungs, but it felt clean. It felt honest. She walked down to the edge of the river. She stood there watching the water flow past, the dark eddies swirling around the rocks. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the warrant officer's pin, the one with the lighthouse. She looked at it for a moment, the silver glinting in the winter sun. Then with a single, fluid motion, she tossed it into the middle of the river. She watched it sink, the small splash swallowed by the current. She didn't need the pin. She didn't need the rank. She didn't need the validation of the system that had tried to break her. She turned and walked back toward the cabin, her steps steady, her head held high. She saw Holloway standing on the porch, a mug of coffee in each hand. He was watching her, his expression one of quiet, unadorned pride. She climbed the steps and took the mug from him. She took a sip, the heat of the coffee spreading through her limbs. "What now?" she asked, her voice a soft, clear note in the morning air. Holloway looked out at the mountains, then back at her. He didn't write an answer this time. He just leaned in and kissed her forehead, his breath a warm mist against her skin. He took her hand and led her back inside, the heavy oak door closing behind them with a solid, final thud. The song of Elena Vance was no longer a broadcast. It was no longer a weapon. It was no longer a secret. It was just the sound of a life being lived, one breath at a time, in a world that was finally quiet enough to hear it. The day passed in a slow, comfortable blur. They cleared the snow from the porch. They fed the fire. They sat together on the sofa, reading the newspapers that Holloway had brought back from town the day before. Elena saw her own face on the third page of the Seattle Times *. It was a grainy photo from her file at Fairchild, the headline reading, *The Shemia Signal, Unanswered Questions in Defense Contractor Collapse. She looked at the photo, the woman in the uniform, the woman with the flat, controlled eyes and the weight of 1,000 secrets on her shoulders. She didn't recognize her. She closed the paper and tucked it under the kindling in the basket. As the sun began to set, casting long, skeletal shadows across the snow, Elena went out to the porch one last time. The world was turning blue, the first stars appearing in the overhead vault. The air was perfectly still, the silence so deep it felt like a physical presence. She stood at the railing, her hands resting on the cold wood. She closed her eyes and focused one last time on the extraordinary capability that lived inside her bones. She didn't look for the radar. She didn't look for the grid. She looked for the people. She felt the 60-cycle hum of Sarah Jenkins' reading lamp in a small house in Spokane. She felt the steady, 12-hertz heartbeat of Captain Holloway standing just behind the door. She felt the 14-hertz ghost signal of the Sentinel audit, still pulsing deep in the guts of the NSA servers, a permanent reminder that the truth was never truly buried. And then she felt something else. Faint, distant, a rhythmic, pulsing vibration coming from the north. It wasn't a machine. It wasn't a signal. It was the aurora borealis, the solar wind hitting the Earth's magnetic field, creating a harmonic dance that most of the world would only ever see. Elena Vance stood in the dark, and she heard the light. It was a beautiful, shimmering B-flat, a frequency of pure, unadulterated energy that sang to the very core of her being. It was the sound of the universe reminding her that no matter how much noise the men of the world created, the music of the spheres was always louder. She felt a single tear track down her cheek, a warm, salty line in the freezing night. She wasn't sad. She wasn't angry. She was just finished. The cost had been everything. The result was this. She turned and went back inside, the warmth of the cabin enveloping her like a shroud. She saw Holloway waiting for her, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. She walked over to him and leaned her head against his chest. She could feel his heart beating, the steady, honest rhythm of a man who had stayed when staying cost him everything. She didn't need to hear the world anymore. She had found the only frequency that mattered. The cabin was quiet, the fire reduced to a low, orange glow. Outside, the snow continued to fall, burying the tracks, the roads, and the history of the woman who had heard too much. Elena Vance closed her eyes and let the silence take her. She was home. The bridge was still standing, the lighthouse was still lit, and the noise had finally, mercifully, gone to sleep. In the morning, she would wake up and start again. She would learn the frequency of the spring, the resonance of the summer, and the harmonic of the fall. She would live a life that was quiet and classified and real. But for now, there was only the dark, the warmth, and the man who saw her clearly when the world was blind. The mission was over. The signal was clear. The mountain was silent at last. Elena Vance reached out in the dark and found Holloway's hand, her fingers interlocking with his. She didn't need to say a word. The truth was in the touch. The story of the woman who could hear the world ended not with a shout, but with a breath. A single, steady, peaceful breath. And in that breath, all the frequencies of her life, the rage, the fear, the competence, the loyalty, and the hope, finally found their perfect, quiet resolution. The world went on, loud and chaotic and broken, but in a small cabin in the Cascades, the frequency was 14. The frequency of the bridge, the frequency of the return, the frequency of home. Elena Vance drifted into a sleep that was no longer a battlefield, her mind a calm, still pool of water reflecting a sky that was finally, after so much noise, completely clear. She knew now that some things are too true to be heard. They can only be felt. And she felt everything. The snow fell in the silence of the American night.